Nobody here is coming to help you.
You'll regret underestimating me.
Move along, Drifter. Not yet. You got a death wish? Then order 6 coffins.
A nameless man, a rope around a woman's neck, and 6 guns laughing until he said, "You better order 6 coffins." Hit follow so you don't miss the best Western story you'll ever hear. The wind came first. It always did in Rattlesnake Ridge. Before the heat, before the stink of copper dust and horse sweat, the wind announced itself by flinging red grit against every window in town. The rusted windmill at the edge of the municipal well screamed as it spun, a sound like a blade being dragged across tin, and nobody bothered to look up anymore. They'd stopped looking up a long time ago. It was a Tuesday in late September, though the calendar hardly mattered out here. Days didn't have names so much as temperatures. This one was a furnace day. The buckboard wagon sat in the middle of Main Street, angled slightly toward the dry goods store, if the driver had second thoughts at the last moment. Maybe he had. The wagon horse, a sway-backed gray mare, stamped one hoof and flicked flies away with her tail. She didn't understand what was about to happen. Animals rarely do. Evelyn Cross stood in the wagon bed. Her wrists were bound behind her with rough cord that had already opened the skin at both wrists. She was 31 years old, small-framed but straight-backed, and she was doing everything in her power not to let a single soul in Rattlesnake Ridge see her hand shaking. The noose around her neck was hemp, poorly tied, thick enough to be theatrical. Grover Pike had a taste for the theatrical. The rope had been looped over the crossbar of the livery awning and drawn just taut enough that Evie had to rise slightly onto her toes to breathe without effort. Grover Pike stood beside the wagon like a man who owned everything he could see. He was broad through the chest, barrel-gutted, with a drinker's red nose and eyes that held the particular kind of meanness that isn't born hot but cultivated cold over years. He wore a brown leather vest over a striped shirt, a Remington on his right hip, and the silver badge of a company marshal pinned to his chest. Sterling Mining and Water Company. The badge said so. He'd had it made special. 5 men flanked him in a loose crescent, all armed, all watching the crowd with the calm attention of men who'd done this kind of work before and found it agreeable. The crowd on the boardwalks numbered maybe 60. Miners still caked from morning shift, shopkeepers in their aprons, women with their children pressed behind them. They watched with the flat, careful expressions of people who understood what was at stake for anybody who opened their mouth. Dr. Jonah Campbell stood at the far edge of the crowd near his clinic steps, gripping his hat brim in both hands, his face gray as ash. Toby was up in the hayloft of the livery, watching through a gap in the boards. He was 10 years old and had nobody to stand beside him, so he watched alone. Pike cleared his throat. "Citizens of Rattlesnake Ridge," he began, loud and unhurried, the voice of a man who enjoyed an audience. "You are witnessing the lawful administration of justice. By order of Sterling Mining and Water Company, operating under Provisional Territorial Charter, Article 9, Section 4. Nobody in the crowd knew what Article 9, Section 4 said. That was the point. Evelyn Cross, widow, residing on Lot 14 of the Eastern Claims, has been found in direct violation of company ordinance regarding the sabotage and deliberate contamination of the Sterling Reservoir, serving this and 3 neighboring communities. It was a lie, a complete and total fabrication. Evelyn had done nothing to the reservoir. What she had done was continue operating her late husband Aaron's deed and assay archive, continue recording land transactions that Sterling's lawyers preferred went unrecorded, and refuse 3 separate cash offers to close her doors and leave the territory. That was her crime, stripped of its costume. She knew it. Pike knew it. Half the people watching knew it. None of it changed anything. Evelyn stared straight ahead, at a point above the crowd's heads. She fixed her eyes on the peak of the distant ridge, blue-gray in the morning haze, and she breathed slow, Her father had once told her that fear was just a story the body told the mind, and the mind didn't have to listen. She'd thought that was foolish when she was young. She didn't think so anymore. The sentence, Pike continued, letting the word sit in the air a moment, is death by hanging. Carried out today, right now. He put his boot on the wagon's rear wheel spoke. That was when they heard the horse. Not running. That was the first thing. A running horse means panic, means flight. This horse was walking. Slow and deliberate, hooves, striking the hard-packed dirt with the measured rhythm of a man who has nowhere urgent to be because he's already arrived. The sound came from the south end of Main Street, and heads turned. The rider came through the red dust like something the desert had decided to spit out. He was mounted on a line-backed dun, a tough, ugly horse with a Roman nose and the lean muscle of an animal that knew hard country. The rider matched the horse. He wore a long trail duster the color of old bone, so caked with 6 days of red dirt that it had taken on the landscape. His hat brim was battered low on one side, pushed up on the other by what looked like an old habit or an old scar. The saddle was plain, no silver, no ornamentation. The rifle in the scabbard was a Winchester, and the iron on his hip was a single-action army that had seen considerable use. He was not a young man, but he wasn't old either. Somewhere in the country between 35 and hard experience, which could mean any age at all. His face was lean, jaw carrying 3 days of dark stubble, eyes set deep under the hat brim, gray eyes, the color of gunmetal in shadow. He rode to the hitching post, outside the barber shop. He dismounted. He secured his reins post with the deliberate, unhurried movements of a man who had no intention of leaving in a hurry. He patted the dun's neck once, absently, the way a man pats a thing he trusts. Then he turned toward the street. He walked forward maybe 30 feet and stopped. Stood there, looking at the wagon. Looking at Evelyn Cross standing in it with a rope around her neck. Looking at Grover Pike. Looking at the 5 men arranged in their loose crescent with their revolvers drawn or ready. Pike stared at him. The 5 men stared at him. The crowd stared at him. The stranger said nothing. Pike looked him over, took in the road dust, the worn boots, the absence of any badge or insignia, or anything that suggested this man was anything other than a drifter who'd picked the worst possible morning to ride into town. Pike smiled. It started with him, one corner of his mouth pulling up. Then one of the gunmen, a lean kid with a red bandana around his throat, let out a short laugh. Then another. Then all 5 of them were laughing, the genuine relaxed laughter of men who see no threat in what they're looking at. Laughing at the ragged, nameless, lone drifter who'd wandered into their moment. One of them, a big man with a full beard, called out, "Boy, you just ride in from nowhere in particular." Another said, "That horse or that coat, which one's older?" The laughter built. Even Pike chuckled, shaking his head slightly, as if this were an unexpected entertainment. The stranger stood in the street and let them laugh. He did not shift his weight, did not glance around at the crowd, did not look down. He stood with his thumbs hooked loosely near his belt, chin-level, gray eyes, moving from face to face with the patience of a man doing arithmetic. Then the laughter began to taper. Not because anything changed, but because something about the way he was standing started to register. The laughter ran out the way water runs out of a cracked barrel, slow. At first, then faster, until the street was quiet again, except for the windmill and the mare stamping her foot. The stranger looked at Pike. "Go on and pull that rope," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't rise to reach people. People leaned in to hear it. "Just make sure you order 6 coffins first." Dead quiet. Pike's smile had gone. Not quickly. It faded the way smiles do when a man's brain catches up to what his gut already knows. He studied the stranger with new attention now. The stance, the absolute stillness, the gun hand resting exactly where it was. No tension in the fingers, no performative threat, just placement, readiness without theater. "That's so," Pike said. "That's so." Pike's eyes went to his men. Brief, just a flicker. 3 of them shifted their weight. One touched the grip of his revolver without drawing it. The kid with the red bandana had stopped smiling entirely. "You don't know what you rode into, Drifter," Pike said. The stranger looked at him with those gunmetal eyes and said nothing at all. Pike made a decision. He was a man of appetites and not much patience, and the decision came the way it always did, from the gut and not the head. He jerked his chin at the kid with the red bandana and said, "Get him." The kid stepped forward. He was fast, legitimately fast. His hand dropped to his iron with the quickness of a young man who'd practiced the motion until it lived in his muscles without thought. He cleared, leather clean, and was bringing the barrel up when the stranger drew. The crowd didn't see it happen so much as they saw the before and the after. Before, the stranger's hand at his side. After, the gun out, pointing not at the kid, not at Pike, but down the line, at the mare. The shot cracked across the street, like a thunderclap. The mare screamed and lunged forward, not falling but driving hard off her hind legs, lurching the wagon ahead, 2 full feet before the brake and the weight of her harness caught her. She didn't go down. The bullet had punched through the thick leather harness strap rather than the animal, a 2-inch strip connecting the collar to the swingle tree, and when it snapped, the mare surged, but the wagon held, pinned by the remaining rigging and its own weight, the front wheels catching in the rutted groove of the street. The wagon rocked hard. Evelyn staggered and caught herself, the rope going briefly taut and then releasing. As the wagon settled back, she gasped, found her footing, forced herself upright. Alive. Still alive. The mare danced and kicked in her partial harness, going nowhere, blocking the wagon, and buying what the stranger needed. Seconds. Just seconds. But precision doesn't need much more. Pike was already spinning toward his Remington when the stranger's second shot took him in the gun hand. Not the wrist, not the arm. The gun hand itself, between the second and third metacarpal. A wound that would end a man's shooting days permanently. The Remington spun out of Pike's grip and hit the dirt. Pike grabbed his hand and made a sound that wasn't quite a word, staggering back against the wagon wheel. The 2 gunmen who charged the stranger made it 4 steps. The first went down when the stranger stepped inside his swing and drove the barrel of the Colt across his temple. With the mechanical efficiency of a man who knows exactly how hard the human skull can absorb impact without quite shattering. He dropped like a marionette with cut strings. The second caught a shoulder shot, fired from close range, that spun him sideways and dropped him to one knee in the dirt. The remaining 2 men, the bearded one and a quiet fellow in a gray shirt, had not charged. They were behind cover now, one behind the corner post of the feed store, one pressed against the far side of the wagon. Smart enough to hesitate, not smart enough to have run when they should have. The street had a different quality to it now. The crowd had pulled back and pressed flat against walls and doorways, but nobody had fled. Nobody looked away. The stranger stood in the middle of the street in a loose half-crouch, breathing easy, gun moving, in a slow, controlled arc across the available angles. His duster was still coated in red road dust. He looked like something the desert assembled from spare parts and irritation. "Last chance to revise the morning's plans," he said. The man behind the corner post of the feed store stepped out with his hands raised and his revolver pointed at the sky. "Grip first." The man in the gray shirt followed 30 seconds later, walking out from behind the wagon with both hands open and visible. Pike was on his knees, cradling his shattered hand against his chest, breathing hard through his nose. The fallen man with the temple wound was unconscious. The shoulder-shot man was sitting in the dirt, pressing his good hand against his wound, and watching the stranger with an expression caught between pain and calculation. The kid with the red bandana had his gun on the ground in front of him, and his hands laced behind his head, without being told. 6 men. 1 down cold, 1 wounded and sitting, 1 on his knees, 2 standing with their hands up, 1 already cooperating. None dead. The stranger lowered his gun. He didn't holster it. He looked at Pike. "Cut her loose," he said. Pike said nothing. His jaw was clenched. His eyes were doing the arithmetic that beaten men's eyes do when they're calculating whether the future holds an opportunity for reversal. I won't say it twice. One of Pike's standing men pulled a belt knife and cut the rope at the wagon post. Evelyn felt the cord go slack around her neck. She exhaled, a single unsteady breath, and brought her bound wrists around in front of her. The cord was tight enough that her fingers had gone partly numb. The stranger walked to the wagon. He stepped up on the wheel spoke and swung into the wagon bed with one smooth motion. He took a folding knife from his duster pocket and cut the cord at her wrists with two quick strokes. Cheap, rough cord, the kind used for bailing. It fell to the wagon floor. He didn't hold her hand, didn't make a production of it. He stepped back down, moved to the front of the wagon, and was checking the harness mare when Evelyn climbed down on her own. She stood in the street. She flexed her fingers to bring sensation back. She looked at Pike, then at the stranger, then at the crowd. She had known some of these people for 9 years. She had filed deeds for their properties, notarized their mining claims, sat with their wives at church. Not one of them had moved. She understood it. She did. Sterling's grip on this town was financial, legal, and violent all at once. These were people with families and debts and no options. You couldn't blame a caged animal for not fighting the bar it couldn't break. You could be disappointed, though. She was. Quietly and without judgment, but entirely. The stranger spoke to Pike without looking at him. He was still checking the harness, assessing whether the mare needed attending. "You'll want to see a doctor about that hand," he said. "Bones like that, left untreated, the hand locks up. You'll lose use of it." He glanced over. "Not that I consider that a tragedy." Pike got to his feet. His face had gone from red to a particular shade of white that men turn when pain and rage occupy the same space with no outlet. He looked at the stranger for a long moment. "You just made a serious mistake," Pike said. "I've made a few," the stranger said. "This morning isn't one of them." Pike gathered his men with a look. The standing two helped the shoulder-shot man to his feet. Somebody scooped the Remington out of the dirt and pressed it into Pike's good hand. The unconscious man was dragged upright between two others, his boots leaving furrows. In the dirt, they walked north. Nobody said another word. The crowd began to breathe again. Someone coughed. A child started crying somewhere in the back, the delayed, bewildered crying of a small person who couldn't process what they'd seen. Boots shuffled on boardwalks. The barber came back to his door. The stranger led the mare to the hitching post and tied her off there where she could settle. He took his hat off, beat the worst of the road dust out of it against his thigh, and put it back on. Evelyn was standing near the wagon. She was watching him. She had done the inventory on him, the way she had learned to do with men who arrived without introduction in difficult circumstances. The clothes said working men, roadmen, nobody's ranch hand or company rider. The gun said something else entirely. The way he'd shot Pike's weapon from his grip rather than putting the bullet. Someplace fatal said something else again. "Who are you?" she said. He looked at her for a moment, gray eyes in shadow. "Clay," he said. She waited to see if there was more. "There wasn't. You rode in at a useful time," she said. "I rode in when I arrived." She glanced toward the north end of the street, where Pike and his men had disappeared. "They'll be back, I expect. Sterling has 30 more like them. I expect that, too." She studied him. He was difficult to read, which she supposed was the idea. Men who could be easily read in a place like Rattlesnake Ridge didn't generally last long enough to get road dust on their coat. "What do you want here?" she said. He looked down the street, then back at her. "Got business in town. We can talk about it. Somewhere that isn't the middle of Main Street." She nodded once. That was reasonable. It was then that the saloon door banged open and the keeper, a heavy man named Aldous Briggs, who supplied the Sterling Company crews at a discount and asked no questions, threw a pan of hot dishwater out onto the steps. The water hit the boardwalk and splashed sideways, catching Toby, who'd come down from the livery hayloft and crept close to watch, directly across the shins and feet. The boy yelped and stumbled back. "Get off my steps," Briggs bellowed. "You're not a customer. You never will be. Get gone." Toby, barefoot, was already scrambling back. He was a thin kid, 10 years old, with a burlap-patched shirt and a bruised look around the eyes that had nothing to do with this specific morning. The stranger looked at the boy. He looked at Briggs. He walked to the saloon door, pulled it open, and stood aside. He looked at Toby. "Come on in," he said. Briggs sputtered. "Now hold on, that boy's not coming in for a meal," the stranger said. He looked at Briggs with those flat gray eyes. "You'll put a plate in front of him. Full plate. Hot, and you'll put it in front of him right now." Briggs looked at the gun, looked at the man, made the kind of rapid cost-benefit calculation that saloon keepers who survive in difficult places are good at. He went back inside. The stranger pulled out a chair at the nearest table, the motion simple and unhurried, and Toby sat in it with the careful way of a child who's not sure a good thing is really happening until it's already happened. A plate came, eggs and salt pork and cornbread, still steaming. The boy looked at it, then at the stranger, then back at it, and started eating with the focused, efficient hunger of someone who'd been missing meals. The stranger sat across from him for a moment, not staring, not hovering, just present. The handful of men in the saloon had gone quiet. 2 miners from the morning's crowd had followed them in and stood near the door watching. The stranger looked around at the room. "A town that hangs its women and starves its children. Ain't a settlement," he said, quiet voice, carrying clearly in the silence. "It's just a livestock pen with a church bell." Nobody had an answer for it. Outside, the windmill screamed in the dry wind, and the red dust settled over Rattlesnake Ridge like it did every morning. And the day continued its brutal business. But something had shifted. Small, maybe. Fragile, certainly. Something had shifted. Evelyn Cross stood in the doorway of the saloon, watching the nameless, road-dusted man sit across from a hungry orphan boy in a town that had forgotten what decent looked like. She thought about Aaron. She thought about the ledgers he'd died for. She thought about what he'd said to her once, near the end when he'd known what was coming. Some men carry a law inside them that no badge can give and no badge can take away. When you find one, Evie, you hold on. She pressed her fingers against the doorframe. She watched Clay pour the boy a cup of water. She hadn't decided anything yet. She was a careful woman, a practical woman, a woman who had learned that good intentions in men were not the same as good character, and that both were not the same as good judgment. She had been disappointed too many times to hurry, but she stood in the doorway and she watched, and the morning light moved slow and red over the ridge, and Rattlesnake Ridge held its breath for the first time in a long time. The feed store behind Main Street smelled like grain dust and old wood, and something faintly sweet that Evelyn had never been able to identify in 9 years of living in Rattlesnake Ridge. Molasses, maybe, or just the memory of it, soaked so deep into the planks that nothing short of fire would pull it out. Clay stood with his back to the wall beside a stack of burlap sacks, arms, hat pushed back slightly on his head. He'd checked the alley before they'd come in, checked the window, checked the single door. He did it without making a show of it, just quick, practiced glances, the way a man does when it's become as natural as breathing. Evelyn noticed. She was sitting on an overturned feed bucket, her wrists resting in her lap. The rope burns had already darkened to raw red lines. She hadn't looked at them since she'd sat down. There was no point in looking at a thing that was going to hurt regardless. "You said you have business here," she said. Clay nodded. He reached into the inside pocket of his duster and produced a folded envelope. The paper was soft with handling, creased so many times that the folds had gone translucent at the edges. He held it out to her. She took it, unfolded it. The handwriting was Aaron's. She'd have known it blindfolded, anywhere on earth. He pressed too hard on his downstrokes, and his capital letters tilted, slightly left, a habit from the schoolmaster who'd taught him as a boy and crossed his wrist with a ruler every time he drifted. Aaron had told her that story 3 times in their marriage. She'd loved him for the way he still looked irritated when he told it. She read. It was dated 14 months ago. Addressed to a man named Clayton Thorne. No location given, just a name. Aaron wrote the way he spoke, direct and without much ornamentation. But the urgency was in every line. He wrote about Sterling, about the water diversion, about the forged assay records, about men going into the mines and not coming out, and the official reports that listed them as accidents, and the families who'd been told to take their grief elsewhere. He wrote that he was compiling evidence, but that the local law was purchased and the territorial courts were slow, and he didn't know how much time he had. He wrote, "You're the only man I've ever trusted with my life, who I believe still has enough of a conscience left to use it. I wouldn't ask if there were anyone else, Clay. Come when you can." Evelyn folded the letter along its worn creases and held it in both hands for a moment. "When did you get this?" she said. "About a year ago," Clay said, "give or take." She looked up at him. "It took you a year." He held her gaze without flinching. "It took me what it took. I was elsewhere." Working, she repeated. She wasn't sure what that word covered, but she had some guesses, and none of them were pleasant. "I got here when I got here," he said. "Same as this morning." She absorbed that. She turned the envelope over in her hands. Aaron's handwriting on the front, Clay's name written in the careful capitals of a man addressing something important. She set it on the feed sack beside her. "Aaron's dead," she said. She said it flat, the way she'd learned to say it. Not because it hurt less that way, but because the alternative, letting the weight of it into her voice every single time, would have finished her months ago. Clay said nothing. For a moment. "When?" he said. 6 months ago. June. She looked at the straw on the floor. There was a collapse in shaft 7 of the Cormorant mine. They said the support timbers gave. They said it was age and poor maintenance. She paused. Aaron wasn't a miner. He was a land recorder. He had no reason to be in shaft 7 at all. Clay was quiet. His jaw moved slightly. The small, controlled movement of a man working something through behind a closed door. "He was looking for something," Clay said. "It wasn't a question. I believe so. I don't know what. He'd stopped telling me things by then." She said it without bitterness, or tried to. "He thought he was protecting me." Clay looked at the envelope on the feed sack. "He write to anyone else?" "Not that I know of. He didn't trust easily." She glanced at him. "Apparently he trusted you." Clay said nothing to that. He moved to the window and looked out at the alley. Nothing there. He moved back. "You two knew each other from the war?" she said. "Before. During. After." For a while, he leaned against the wall again. Aaron Cross was one of 3 men I've ever met in my life who was genuinely better than he had any right to be, given what the war did to people. It was the most he'd said at once. She heard the past tense in it, and she felt the weight of it, which was considerable. "He spoke of you," she said. "Not often. He didn't talk about that time much. But once or twice he mentioned a man named Clay. Said you had a gift for reading a situation before it finished forming. He overstated it. He wasn't given to exaggeration." Clay looked at her steadily. "No, he wasn't." They stayed with that for a moment. Outside, the wind pushed a loose shutter somewhere down the alley, a rhythmic bang against dry wood. Evelyn studied Clay with the direct attention she'd developed over years of reviewing claims and deeds, looking for the falsified survey marker, the deliberately vague boundary description, the signature that didn't quite match. She'd gotten good at finding the thing that didn't belong. She didn't find it in him. That was what bothered her. Men who were very good at violence generally wore it one of 2 ways. Either they wore it loud, the swagger and the deliberate menace, performing it for the room, making sure you understood the threat before you made any unwise decisions. Or they wore it buried so deep it came out wrong, in cruelty or in drink, or in the random directionless anger of a man who'd stopped knowing what he was. Clay wore it like a tool, a hammer on a belt, not displayed, not hidden, just there, for when it was needed, and otherwise set aside. She didn't know what to do with that yet. "You're not here for blood money," she said. "No. Sterling's put bounties out before. He imports men for it." She tilted her head slightly. "You're not that." "No. Then what exactly are you planning to do?" He looked at her. "Finish what Aaron started. Get the evidence out. Put it in front of a federal court that Sterling's money hasn't reached yet." He paused. "Then leave." That last part landed with a particular flatness. She registered it. "You think it's that simple?" she said. "No, I think it's that necessary." He shifted slightly. Simple and necessary aren't the same thing. She picked up the envelope again, turned it in her hands, set it back down. Aaron had a ledger. Figures, transactions, dates, proof of the water diversion going back 4 years, and evidence of the forged assay records that let Sterling undercut every independent claim in the valley. She looked up. "I looked for it after he died. It wasn't at home. It wasn't in the office. I went through everything twice." Clay watched her. "Aaron was careful," she said. "He didn't leave things in obvious places." She paused. "The only person he trusted the way he trusted you, locally, was Dr. Jonah Campbell, the physician. Town doctor. He operates a clinic on the south end, near the old Mission Road. Sterling's tried to shut him down 3 times. Hasn't managed it yet." She stood. Campbell would know. If Aaron hid something with anyone in this town, it was him. Clay nodded slowly. "All right, not today," she said. "Going to Campbell's clinic today, after what just happened on Main Street, would tell every set of eyes Sterling has in this town exactly where we're headed." She held his gaze. "You do understand that this town is watched." He almost smiled. Just a fractional movement at the corner of his mouth. "Mrs. Cross, I've been in this town for approximately 2 hours." "Then let me be clear," she said. "The man who runs the feed store reports to Sterling's foreman. So does the barkeep at the Silver Spur, the deputy who smells like he bathes in bourbon, and at least 2 of the women who work the laundry on 4th Street. She folded her arms. "In Rattlesnake Ridge, the walls don't just have ears. They have mouths, and those mouths have been paid." Clay looked at her with something that might have been reassessment. "You've been paying attention." "I've been surviving," she said. "It requires the same skill set." He nodded. "Tonight, then. Campbell's clinic. Tonight." She moved toward the door and then stopped. She didn't turn all the way around, just enough to address the wall beside the door, rather than him directly. "I'm not in the habit of trusting strangers," she said, "particularly strangers who arrive at convenient moments. That's wise. Aaron trusted you. That counts for something." She paused. "It doesn't count for everything." "I wouldn't ask it to," he said. She went out. Clay stayed in the feed store for another minute. He picked up the envelope from the feed sack, looked at Aaron's handwriting one more time, and folded it carefully back into the inside pocket of his duster. Then he went out into the red afternoon. The saloon, when he returned to check on the boy, was half empty. The lunch-hour crowd had thinned to 2 miners nursing beers at the back table, and a man asleep in the corner with his hat over his face. Toby was still at the front table, though the plate was long clean. He'd found a piece of brown paper somewhere and was drawing on it with a charcoal stub, bent over the table, with his tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth. Clay sat down across from him again. Toby looked up. He had brown eyes, steady and watchful, with the specific quality of children who've had to learn people quickly because their safety depended on accurate reads. "You work the livery?" Clay said. "Yes, sir. Mucking, mostly. Some brushing. Mr. Heck lets me sleep in the loft if I do the morning feed." "He pay you?" Toby's expression said clearly that this was a question from a man unfamiliar with his circumstances. "Not with money." "Meals?" "Sometimes. If there's extra." Clay looked at the empty plate. He didn't say anything about it. He signaled Briggs without looking at him, a simple 2-finger gesture, and a moment later another cup of water appeared at Toby's elbow. Briggs set it down without comment and retreated quickly. "You see much from that loft?" Clay said. Toby hesitated. The hesitation of a child who has learned that information is a currency that can get you hurt if you spend it wrong. "I'm not asking you to spy," Clay said. I'm asking if you're observant. I see things, Toby said carefully. Good. Clay rested his arms on the table. You see anything this morning before I rode in? Anything that struck you as different from the usual? You tell me. You don't have to decide right now whether you trust me enough for that. You can decide later. Toby looked at him for a long moment. Pike came in last night, he said. Real late, him and two others. They had the wagon with them already. I didn't know what for until morning. He glanced at the door. They was laughing. About Mrs. Cross? About the whole thing. About how easy it was going to be. Toby's jaw tightened slightly. A child's jaw doing an adult's job. She's been good to me, Mrs. Cross. She lets me sit in the archive sometimes when it's cold. Doesn't make me do anything for it. Clay looked at him. She know you saw this morning? No, sir. All right. He stood. You keep your head down today. Don't go near Pike's men. Don't tell anyone I spoke to you. Toby nodded, already going back to his drawing with the charcoal stub. Clay went to the door, then turned back. What are you drawing? Toby held up the paper. It was the main street of Rattlesnake Ridge, rendered in rough charcoal lines with surprising accuracy. The windmill, the livery, the buckboard wagon, and in the middle of the street, a figure in a long coat. Clay looked at it for a moment. Not bad, he said. He went out. The afternoon was the worst part of the day in Rattlesnake Ridge. The sun came directly overhead, and the heat had nowhere to go, bouncing between the storefronts and the baked dirt until the whole street became a kind of radiant oven. The copper dust, always present, always coating the inside of your lungs by sundown, shimmered in the heat haze. The mountains to the east were completely bleached out, invisible behind white sky. Clay spent the afternoon in a way that looked like idleness. He sat on the boardwalk outside the barber shop, hat tilted down, seemingly asleep. He was not asleep. He was watching foot traffic, watching which men went in and out of the company office at the north end of Maine, watching which way the deputy walked his rounds and at what intervals, watching which buildings had second-floor windows facing the street. He was building a map, not on paper. In the part of his mind where maps lived, spatial and tactical, filed next to a decade and a half of hard-learned lessons about terrain and sight lines and the reliable human habit of repeating patterns. By 3 o'clock, he had a reasonable picture of the town's rhythms. Sterling's office had 3 regular messengers going in and out. The deputy was on a 90-minute circuit, slow and sloppy, with a 20-minute gap on the south end where he stopped at the widow Harkin's house, for what Clay assumed were unofficial reasons. The feed store owner had gone north once, toward the company office, and come back in under 10 minutes. Brief report. Nothing urgent, just the morning's events logged and delivered. He was expected. Clay had assumed as much. By 4 o'clock, the sun had tilted enough to give the west side of the street a narrow band of shade, and Clay moved his chair into it. A man came out of the barber shop and looked at him, and then went back inside. 2 women crossed the street and did not look at him, which meant they were actively not looking at him, which was different. 3 miners coming off shift passed by, and one of them, a young man with a Mexican accent and a bad cough, met Clay's eyes briefly. Just briefly. There was something in it. A measuring look. The look of a man deciding something. He kept moving. Kept coughing. Clay watched him go. Just before sundown, Evelyn appeared at the end of the street. She'd changed her dress and put her hair up and was carrying a basket. The posture of a woman running an ordinary errand. She was good at it. She walked at the right pace, stopped to exchange a few words with the dry goods owner's wife, didn't look toward Clay at all. She passed the barber shop and dropped a folded piece of paper from the basket without breaking stride. Clay picked it up when he stood to stretch. It was an address, the clinic, and below it, back entrance. After 10, he tucked it in his coat. The evening came in shades of purple and orange over the western ridge, spectacular and indifferent, the way sunsets are in Arizona, putting on a show for nobody in particular. Clay ate supper at the hotel dining room, the only establishment in Rattlesnake Ridge that served food in the evening without also serving liquor, which limited the clientele to the hotel guests, two school teachers, and a traveling salesman from Tucson who kept looking at Clay and trying to decide if he was interesting enough to talk to. He was not interesting enough to talk to. Not tonight. Clay ate his beans and cornbread and thought about Aaron Cross. They'd met in '63, outside Chattanooga. Two young men in dusty blue who had nothing in common except a mutual decision to get through the next hour still breathing. Aaron had lent him a dry pair of socks during a 2-week rain, and Clay had returned the favor by pulling him out from under a collapsed ammunition cart 3 weeks later. It was the kind of friendship the war manufactured, fast and total, and sealed by proximity to death. After, they drifted apart the way men do. Clay had gone back to the law, eventually wearing a marshal's badge in the New Mexico territory. Aaron had gone to Arizona, married, built something quiet and good with his hands. And then Fort Garrison happened. Clay set down his spoon. He didn't think about Fort Garrison if he could help it. There was a discipline to not thinking about certain things, a practice turning away that he'd built over 3 years, like a man building a wall around a wound. It didn't heal the wound, but it kept people from looking at it. What happened at Fort Garrison was what happened when a corrupt superior gave an order and a young marshal executed it without enough questions. 7 civilians paid the price for that particular combination of misplaced loyalty and insufficient doubt. Clay had walked away from his badge the next morning, handed it in without explanation. The men who'd signed the order were still drawing government wages last he'd checked. He thought about Aaron's letter. Come when you can. No accusation in it. No bitterness about the year's delay. Just trust, extended across the distance like a hand. He pushed the bowl away and paid for his meal. The town went quiet after 9. It went quiet the way frightened places go quiet, not peacefully but carefully. Lamps extinguished. Voices dropped. The company saloon, up north, was still lit and loud, Pike's men presumably medicating their wounded pride. But the civilian parts of Rattlesnake Ridge shuttered early and stayed shuttered. Clay gave it until 10:30. He went south along the alley behind the hardware store, keeping to the wall, moving on the packed earth that didn't shift or creak. The moon was 3/4 full and cast enough light to navigate by, which meant it also cast enough light to be seen by. He kept to shadows where they offered themselves and moved quickly across the open stretches. Dr. Campbell's clinic sat on the edge of the Mission Road at the south end of town, an adobe building with a pitched tin roof and shuttered windows that glowed faintly with lantern light from within. A hand-lettered sign above the front door said Jonah Campbell, M.D. All treated beneath it, someone had written in a different hand, in smaller letters regardless of means. The addition looked newer than the sign. The back entrance was a plank door beside the woodpile. Evelyn was already there, standing in the shadow of the woodpile, with her shawl pulled tight. She'd come a different way than him. She nodded when she saw him, no words. She knocked on the back door twice, then once. It opened almost immediately. Dr. Jonah Campbell was a lean man in his mid-50s, with a physician's permanently tired eyes and ink-stained fingers, and a way of standing that suggested he'd spent 20 years leaning over examination tables. He wore a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled past his elbows and a worn canvas apron. He looked at Clay with the careful attention of a man assessing a new patient before the patient has said what's wrong. "Come in," he said quietly. Quickly. Inside was not what Clay had expected. The front of the clinic was a standard examination room, basic but orderly, a cabinet of medical supplies, a table, a wash basin. But beyond the curtained partition at the back, the clinic opened into what had clearly once been a storage space, now converted. There were pallets on the floor, blankets, and on those pallets were people. Minors, men, women, some older children. Clay counted 16 at a glance, probably more beyond his sightline. Some were sleeping. Some were awake, watching him with the cautious eyes of people accustomed to strangers bringing trouble. Several of the adults were visibly unwell in ways that went beyond ordinary illness. A grayness to their skin, a particular labored quality to their breathing. Swollen joints, the signs of prolonged poisoning that Clay had seen before in mining districts, with bad ventilation and worse management. Campbell pulled the curtain, mostly closed, behind them. "Lead," he said simply, looking at Clay, "in the water that feeds the lower worker quarters. Has been for 2 years at least, possibly longer. The assay records that would prove it have been falsified, so the company has clean numbers on paper and poison in the pipes." He looked at Evelyn, then back. "Sterling has also blocked my medical supply deliveries for the past 8 months. I'm working with what I can source locally and what people bring from their own stores." Clay looked through the gap in the curtain at the people on the pallets. A woman was awake, nursing an infant, watching him. "How many total?" he said. "Affecting this level of severity? Close to 40 families in the lower quarter." Campbell crossed his arms over his apron. "There are men in those shafts who don't know they're being poisoned. They think it's the work, think it's the dust. I can tell them the truth, but I can't treat them properly without supplies, and I can't force Sterling's hand without the assay records." Evelyn stepped forward. "Aaron gave you something. It wasn't a question." "Exactly." Campbell looked at her, and something moved across his face, a grief that had been carried quietly. "And at length he did," Campbell said. He went to the medical supply cabinet, opened it, moved a row of brown glass bottles aside, and from behind them produced a small tin box of the kind used for wound dressings. He set it on the examination table. Inside was a folded oilskin packet, sealed with wax. "He brought it 3 days before the collapse," Campbell said. "He told me if anything happened to him, it went to the territorial court in Prescott. No one else." He looked at Clay. "Evelyn told me about you, about the letter." He paused. "Are you the man Aaron said you were?" Clay looked at him steadily. "I'm the man Aaron knew," he said. "Whether that's who he said I was, I couldn't tell you." Campbell studied him for a long moment. Then he picked up the oilskin packet and held it out. Clay took it. He turned it over in his hands. It was solid, packed full, sealed well. Aaron had been thorough. He always had been. "There's something else," Campbell said. He went to the curtain and looked through it at the sleeping room beyond. "2 of those men planned to leave the territory this week, with their families. Sterling's men told them their work contracts are terminated, and they have 10 days to vacate company housing." He turned back. "When they leave, they take whatever knowledge they have with them, and the ones who stay watch them go, and they think about whether anyone is coming." Clay set the packet carefully in his inside coat pocket, beside Aaron's letter. "They need to know someone's coming," Evelyn said quietly. "Someone is," Clay said. Campbell nodded once, slowly. It was the nod of a man who wants to believe something and is deciding to let himself. "I'll need access to this clinic," Clay said. "Covert. Medical supplies. I can source some from outside the territory. There are ways." He looked at Campbell. "And if things go badly on any given evening, you'll receive people who need tending." "That has always been true of this clinic," Campbell said. "Tonight's no different." From the sleeping room, one of the men had a coughing fit, deep and wet and prolonged. A woman's voice murmured something in Spanish. The coughing eventually stilled. Clay looked through the gap in the curtain at the rows of sick people lying on their pallets in the rough, converted storage room of an underfunded clinic at the edge of a poisoned town. He thought about Fort Garrison. He thought about the things that happen when good men delay too long and ask too few questions. He thought about Aaron's letter. Come when you can. He'd come when he could. He was here now. Evelyn was watching him from across the examination table. She'd been watching him all evening. He knew. Cataloging, measuring, she had every right to. Trust extended to a stranger was a debt taken on faith, and faith was the most expensive currency in a place like Rattlesnake Ridge. He met her eyes. He didn't offer reassurance. Reassurance was cheap. What he offered was steadiness, which was the only thing worth offering. She held his gaze for a moment, and then looked away. Outside, the night wind came down from the ridge, rattling the tin roof in long, slow waves. The lantern flickered inside its glass. The sleeping room breathed. Tomorrow would be what it was going to be. Tonight, at least, they had the packet. They had the truth, sealed in oilskin, carried in Aaron Cross's careful handwriting. It was a beginning. The home sat on the eastern edge of town, where the last of the built lots gave way to scrub and Kalish Flat. It had been a decent house once. 2 rooms and a covered porch, timber-framed, with a proper stone chimney and shuttered windows that still held their glass. Aaron Cross had built it himself over 2 summers before Evelyn arrived, and she had always been able to see his particular thoroughness in the way the corners met and the way the porch posts were set deep into the ground. Aaron believed in doing a thing right, even when doing it adequately. Would have served. What Sterling's men had done to it was thorough in a different way. The front door hung from one hinge, angled into the room like a broken wing. Inside, the desk where Evelyn kept her record books had been overturned, its contents scattered and partially burned in a pile near the hearth. The filing cabinets that held the assay copies and deed records had been pried open and emptied onto the floor. Some pages were torn. Some were missing. The small framed daguerreotype of Aaron that had sat on the windowsill was on the floor, its glass cracked clean across his face. Evelyn walked through it without speaking. Clay came in behind her and stood near the door. He took it all in methodically, the way he'd done the clinic, the way he'd done Main Street. Not lingering, not reacting, just building the picture. "When did they do this?" he said. "Last night." She crouched and picked up a handful of loose pages, sorted through them briefly, set them down. They didn't take everything. Whatever they were looking for, they didn't find it. The ledger. The ledger. She stood. "They've done this twice before. Always looking for the same thing." She looked around the room. "They won't find it here because it was never here." Clay moved through the room slowly. He picked up the daguerreotype from the floor, looked at it once, and set it carefully on the windowsill with the cracked glass face up so it rested level. He said nothing about it. The record office portion of the house was the back room, separated from the living quarters by a plank partition. It had fared worse. The shelves Aaron had built along 2 walls were mostly pulled down, their brackets bent, the boards themselves cracked. Ink bottles had been smashed against the floor, leaving dark stains across the planks. A chair had been put through the window, and the dry night air came through the gap and lifted the loose pages in small, aimless currents. Evelyn stood in the middle of it. She'd seen it this morning, before the hanging. She'd been walking to the well when she found her front door hanging open. That was what they'd wanted her to find. First, the destruction of her work, before they brought her out to Main Street with a rope. A neat sequence. Wreck the evidence, eliminate the woman, done. Clay was looking at the window with the broken chair still lodged through it. He gripped the chair back and worked it free without dramatics, set it outside on the ground, and looked at the window frame. It was fixable. The frame was intact. "You said there was a knife wound earlier," Evelyn said. She didn't know exactly why she said it then. Maybe because she needed to be useful, and tending a wound was something she knew how to do. "At the clinic, when I was looking for where you were hit during the street, I saw an old scar near your shoulder. There was fresh blood on your shirt." Clay glanced down. He'd been favoring that side slightly. He hadn't said anything about it. "Reopened," he said. "From this morning. It'll close on its own. Or it won't, and you'll be no use to anyone." She moved past him toward the kitchen at the side of the living quarters. It had been ransacked, too, but they'd been less thorough. Here, the practical cruelty of men on a deadline. She found the tin box with her needle and thread on its side behind the overturned flour bin. She found the lamp. She lit it. He sat at the kitchen table without argument. That surprised her. She'd expected him to deflect the way men generally did about injury, turning it into a negotiation or a minimization. He just sat and shrugged the right side of his duster off his shoulder. The shirt beneath was dark flannel, And on the upper left, below the collarbone and wrapping toward the shoulder blade, the fabric was dark with dried blood. Old scar, as she'd said. A knife wound from the depth and shape of it, healed years ago, but never quite flush with the surroundings. Skin. Something had caught it this morning, probably one of the outlaws in the melee, a blade or a sharp corner, and pulled it open again along the original line. She worked in silence. Cleaned it with what she had, which wasn't much, a little clean water and some cloth she tore from a shirt that had already been ruined by the raiders. Threaded the needle by lamplight, with the focused attention of a woman who'd learned to do this by necessity and not by preference. He sat still, completely still, the way men are still when they've trained themselves out of flinching. She stitched the wound with small, even stitches, and he breathed at a regular pace throughout and said nothing. But in the lamplight, with her this close, she saw things she hadn't in the dimness of the clinic or the daylight of the feed store. There were other scars, not just the one she was tending. Across the right forearm, a burn scar, old and fully healed, wide enough to have been significant at the time. Below his left ear, a thin white line, the clean track of a bullet that had missed by a margin. Most men couldn't have survived without re-examining their choices. His hands, resting flat on the table while she worked, were crossed with the small scars of a working life, but also with something else, a particular callus pattern on the right that came from one specific repeated motion. She'd grown up with her father's hands. Her father had been a carpenter. She knew the difference between a working man's hands and a fighting man's hands. These were both. She tied off the last stitch and snipped the thread. "You were a lawman," she said. She didn't ask it. His shoulders settled slightly. An exhale. Was. What happened? A pause. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I followed an order." "I shouldn't have followed," he said. "And people who had nothing to do with it paid for my compliance." She let that sit. She dabbed the closed wound once more with the cloth, and then moved back to give him room to pull the shirt and duster back up. "You walked away from the badge after," she said. "The morning after. And the man who gave the order?" Clay's jaw tightened. "Just briefly. Still drawing a government wage, last I checked." She sat down across the table from him and looked at the lamp flame for a moment. The kitchen around them was a ruin of overturned crockery and scattered provisions. Flour across the floor in a pale drift, beans and dried corn mixed into it from an overturned sack. It looked like the aftermath of a storm. It looked, she thought, like the last 3 years of her life given physical form. "Aaron knew," she said. "About what happened to you, I mean. Some of it. He never told me the specifics. He just said once that you were carrying something heavy and that the weight of it was the only reason a man that capable wasn't still marshalling." She looked at him. "He wasn't critical of you," he said it. The way he said things he felt sad about. Clay looked at the lamp. Something moved in his face and then settled. "He was a better man than I managed to be," Clay said. "Under the same pressures, he'd have made a better decision." "You don't know that." "I know it." She didn't argue the point. She'd learned from Aaron that men who carried this particular flavor of guilt needed to hold on to it for reasons that were complicated, and that arguing them out of it was a different and longer project than any single conversation. She stood. Her hands were tired. Her whole body was tired. The bone-deep exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from sustained fear, the kind you carry at a controlled volume for hours, because putting it down would mean admitting you weren't sure you could pick it back up. "You can sleep in Aaron's workshop," she said. "It's behind the house. They didn't touch it, I don't think. It's just a lean-to, but it's dry and the roof holds. I'll be fine at the hotel." The hotel owner reports to Sterling's foreman. She looked at him with the flat patience of someone repeating information they'd already said. "I told you this town is watched." He almost said something, and then accepted the logic instead. "All right. There's a blanket on the cot in there. I don't know what condition it's in, Mrs. Cross." She stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for the stitching." She looked at him for a moment. Don't pull them loose, she said. I don't have much thread left. She took the lamp and went to her room, which they'd gone through too. The mattress pulled off the bed frame and the wardrobe emptied onto the floor. She set the mattress back herself, gathered what bedding hadn't been ruined, and lay down in her clothes with the lamp turned low. She looked at the ceiling and thought about Aaron. In the particular quiet of the house, the wind pressing at the repaired window and the lamp giving its small, steady light, she had a conversation with him that she'd been having in pieces for 6 months. Not morbid, not desperate, just the ongoing conversation of someone who'd shared a life with a person and hadn't stopped thinking with them even after they were gone. You sent him, she thought. A year ago, you sent for him, and now he's here. She thought about the letter. Come when you can? Aaron had known then, she thought. Had known things were closing in. Had made arrangements. Had trusted the right person with the right information, distributed it in ways that would survive the worst outcome. He had always been thorough. She pressed her palm flat against the empty side of the bed. All right, she thought. I see what you did. I'll carry it from here. She closed her eyes. In the morning, she woke to sound. For one disoriented moment, she lay still and listened, placing it. Rhythmic, wooden, striking coming from outside the back of the house. She got up, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and went out through the kitchen to the back. The lean-to workshop sat 20 feet behind the house, half shaded by a large mesquite that had been there before the house and would be there after it. Aaron had used the workshop for repairs. His woodworking tools were still on the wall where he'd left them, hung in the careful order of a man who believed tools deserved their proper place. Clay was working on the back door. The door between the kitchen and the small back porch had been kicked in at some point, not by last night's raiders. This was older damage, and the frame had been cracked at the lower hinge. The door swung wrong because of it, dragging against the floor and letting in a constant thin draft. She'd gotten so used to it, she'd mostly stopped noticing. He'd noticed. He was using Aaron's mallet, the good one. The one with Aaron's name, carved into the handle in the blocky self-taught letters of a man who'd learned to carve his name onto his tools early so they'd come back to him. Clay was setting a new piece of timber into the lower door frame, working the fit with a patience that had nothing performative about it. Just a man and a task, and the early morning light coming gold and clean over the ridge. He hadn't heard her come out. She stood on the back porch and watched him work. He was using Aaron's mallet. He was being careful with it. She could see that, the way he held it, not gripping it too tight, not swinging it careless, treating it like something worth treating well. He fit the new timber, tested the fit, adjusted it slightly, tested it again. She didn't know where he'd gotten the replacement timber. From the wood pile, probably from the stack of rough-cut boards Aaron had kept for repairs. He had found the right piece in the dark or in the early dawn, before she was awake, and he had started on the door before she'd opened her eyes. She went to the fence. The perimeter fence on the east side of the yard had been leaning for 2 winters. 3 posts had gone soft at the ground line, and the whole run of fence had developed a gradual tilt that she'd propped up with a stick at the worst point, and left for the spring, and then left again. It was still leaning. Clay had already been at it. 2 of the 3 bad posts had new gravel packed around their bases. He'd retensioned the wire where it had gone slack. The 3rd post was still soft, but he'd braced it temporarily with a notched stake. It would hold until proper replacement. He'd done all of this before she woke up. He hadn't left a note about it, hadn't announced it, hadn't asked permission, or made it something she needed to acknowledge. He'd just seen what needed doing, and done it quietly, with Aaron's mallet, in the early morning before the town started watching. She stood at the fence and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not gratitude, exactly. She was grateful, yes, but that was simple and small compared to what she actually felt. What she felt was something closer to recognition. The particular feeling of seeing someone do a thing that reveals their character more completely than anything they could have said. Aaron had been like that. He showed himself through the doing of things. He never explained his values. He enacted them. She went inside and made coffee with what the raiders had left, which wasn't much, but there was enough ground coffee in the tin they'd overlooked, and enough water in the back bucket. She made it strong. She brought 2 cups out to the back porch. Clay finished driving the last pin into the door frame and tested the door. It swung clean, seated properly in the frame. No drag, no... He turned and saw the coffee. She held out a cup. He took it. He looked at the door, and then looked at her. He seemed like he was trying to decide whether to say something about it, and then deciding not to. "Fence posts on the east run," she said. 2 of them were yours. The 3rd needs proper replacement. Ground soft under it. I know. There's a spare post in the back of the workshop. He nodded. He drank his coffee. She leaned against the porch post and looked out at the yard. The mesquite was starting to yellow at the edges with the fall, though it would be a mild fall and a milder winter, this far south. The mountains were clear this morning, properly visible, gray-blue, and patient on the horizon. "There's something I haven't told you," she said. He waited. Aaron kept a 2nd set of records. Not the ledger, not the one in the oilskin packet. Something different. Personal accounts. Testimonies he took from miners directly. Sworn statements about working conditions, about what they saw, about illness. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. He took them in his own hand, in longhand, from people who couldn't write. He was very careful about them. "Where are they?" "I don't know. Exactly. He told me they existed, but not where. He said the fewer people who knew their location, the better." She paused. "He said he'd taken them to someone in the lower worker quarter, someone he trusted completely." Clay turned this over. "Man or woman?" "He didn't say. He just said someone who's got nothing left to lose, and therefore the most reason to fight." That was how he said it. She could hear Aaron's voice when she said it. She let herself hear it for a moment. "I've been trying to figure out who he meant for 6 months. The miners I need to speak with," Clay said. He looked at the mountains. Campbell said, 2 families are planning to leave the territory. "I heard that. Before they go, I need to find them." He set his empty cup on the porch rail. "And I need to find out which of their neighbors Aaron trusted enough to give testimony to." She nodded. "There's a woman in the lower quarter named Rosaria Vega. Her husband died in the cormorant shaft 6 months ago. Same collapse that killed Aaron." She looked at Clay directly. "She has 4 children and no income, and Sterling's men told her she has until the end of the month to vacate company housing." She paused. If Aaron was going to trust someone, he'd trust a woman who had the most to lose and had lost it already. Clay picked up his cup from the rail and turned toward the kitchen door. "I'll go this evening," he said. "You'll tell me where to find her. I'll take you." He stopped. "Mrs. Cross. She won't talk to you alone," she said. "She doesn't know you. She knew Aaron and she knows me." She held his gaze. "You can manage Sterling's men on your own. That's clear enough. But you can't walk into a grieving woman's home in the lower quarter and expect her to hand you her dead husband's sworn testimony before she's decided you're worth trusting." He looked at her for a moment. "Fair," he said. They went inside. She spent the morning sorting what could be salvaged from the record office. Clay was in and out, carrying debris to the burn pile, rehanging the shelves that could be rehung, stacking what he couldn't fix neatly against the wall. He didn't ask what she wanted done with things. He made reasonable decisions and did them. And the 3 or 4 times he found something that required her judgment, he set it on the cleared section of the desk without comment. Around mid-morning, she found a box of record files that had been dumped but not destroyed. Cross-referencing deeds, mostly. She went through them systematically. 90% was intact. They'd been looking for the ledger, not her files, and in their haste, they'd scattered without reading. "They missed something," she said, not to Clay specifically, just to the room. He was rehanging a shelf bracket. "What?" "The deed cross-reference files. Aaron was using them to track claim transfers. When Sterling's company bought land, they used shell buyers, different names, different dates, to hide the accumulation. She held up a thick folder. Aaron flagged the pattern in these. The names, the timing, the amounts. She looked at Clay. This isn't the ledger, but it's corroborating evidence. Clay came over and looked at the files. He didn't touch them. He looked. Add it to the oilskin packet, he said. It won't fit. Then we need a second packet. He looked at her. You have oilskin? In the workshop. I'll find it. He did. They spent an hour that afternoon resealing the additional documents carefully with wax from the stub of a candle she found under the kitchen shelf. She pressed Aaron's seal ring into the wax out of habit, the small oval with the initial C pressed into copper that she still wore on her right hand, because she hadn't known what else to do with it. Clay watched her do it, but didn't ask about the ring. By late afternoon, the house was not repaired. Not by a long reach, but it was ordered. The worst of the damage was addressed or set aside. The door worked, the fence held. The floor was swept of its flour and scattered beans. The shelves in the record room bore what files remained, not in their original order yet, but gathered, stacked, intact. She stood in the record room and looked at it. She'd spent so many hours in this room. Aaron would sit across from her at the desk when he worked late, a shared lamp between them, the scratch of his pen and the scratch of hers. The occasional exchange about a difficult notation or an unusual claim boundary. It had been the most ordinary of domestic arrangements, and she had valued it in the way you value things that are reliable and present, without knowing how much until they are neither. The room looked almost like itself again, not the same. Something that had been in it was permanently absent, and she knew it, and she wasn't pretending otherwise. But it looked like a room where work could continue. That was enough. For today, that was enough. Clay appeared in the doorway. He'd washed his face and hands at the back pump and rolled his sleeves down again. He was carrying his hat. The woman in the lower quarter, he said. Rosaria Vega. We'll go after supper. She straightened a file on the top shelf. It's better to visit after dark. Les observed. He nodded. He looked around the room, the reset shelves, the stacked files, the wax-sealed packets now tucked inside the iron box she'd moved from under the floorboards. He built this room for you, Clay said. She looked at him, Aaron. He wrote about it in a letter once, when I was still marshalling. Said he'd built a proper archive room because his wife was serious about her work, and serious people needed serious space. He turned his hat in his hands. He was proud of that of you. She looked at the shelves. She pressed her lips together for just a moment. He was a good man, she said. The best I knew, Clay said. She pulled her shawl off the hook by the door and put it around her shoulders. Come on, she said. I'll make supper from what they left me, which isn't much. But there's cornmeal, and I have salt pork buried in the cold box they didn't find. She moved past him into the kitchen. After we eat, we go to Rosaria's. He followed her. The kitchen smelled like coffee still, even hours later. She found the salt pork. She found the cornmeal. She built a fire in the stove from the wood box that hadn't been touched. Apparently, even Sterling's men didn't disturb a man's firewood. Some lines holding even in lawlessness. Clay sat at the kitchen table and watched her work. She didn't ask him to help. He didn't offer until she was carrying something that required two hands, at which point he stood and took the heavy end of the pot without being asked and set it on the stove. They ate in the kitchen as the sun went down. Not much conversation. They were past the point of conversation, for conversation's sake. There was work ahead tonight, and they both knew it, and the quiet was not uncomfortable. She washed the plates. He dried them, locating the shelf for them on the first try, which meant he'd been paying attention to the kitchen's order even while it was in chaos. She didn't remark on this. She put on her second shawl over the first, as the night air came through the repaired door with its clean swinging hinge. Ready, he said. Yes, she said. Outside, the stars were coming in hard and bright over the ridge, the particular brilliance of high desert night. that people from the east always found startling. The town to the west was mostly dark, the company saloon still throwing light and sound at the north end. The rest of Rattlesnake Ridge contained and quiet behind its shuttered windows. She led. He followed. The evening ahead had its own weight, its own uncertainties. What Rosaria Vega would tell them, or refuse to tell them. What Aaron had entrusted to her grief-sharpened safekeeping. What was written in those testimonies, if they existed. But behind them, the house stood with its door properly hung, and its fence holding and its records in order. And on the workshop wall, Aaron's mallet hung back in its place. Rosaria Vega's house was the third on the left, past the pump station in the lower worker quarter, distinguished from its neighbors by the small clay pot of dried marigolds on the windowsill. Dead now, gone brown and brittle in the fall, but still there. Still tended to, in the sense that nobody had thrown them out. Evelyn knocked twice. The door opened on a chain, one dark eye in the gap, then the chain came off, and the door swung wide. Rosaria was 38, and looked 10 years older than that, the arithmetic of hard labor and harder grief. She was short and broad-shouldered, her black hair streaked with silver and pulled back severely, her hands already roughened past what her age should have required. She wore a cotton house dress and an expression of permanent wariness that softened precisely 1 degree. When she saw Evelyn, she looked at Clay. "He's with me," Evelyn said. He was Aaron's friend. Rosaria studied him for a long moment, with the flat, undeceived eyes of a woman who'd learned to read men accurately because her safety had depended on it. Then she stepped back from the door. They went in. The house was 1 room. 4 children were arranged around it in various stages of sleep, 2 small ones already under blankets on the floor pallet, 2 older ones at the table, with a shared lamp working figures on a slate. The house smelled like chili peppers and tallow and the particular warmth of a small space occupied by several people. Rosaria didn't ask them to sit. She stood near the cold fireplace and crossed her arms. "What do you want?" she said. Her English was precise and deliberate, each word placed carefully. "Aaron gave you something," Evelyn said, "before he died. Testimonies, written accounts from the men." Rosaria's expression didn't change. "Who told you that?" "Aaron did," Evelyn said, in a roundabout way. "He told me they existed, and that he'd given them to someone in this quarter who had the most reason to fight." She paused. "I've thought about that for 6 months, Rosaria. I keep coming back to you." The 2 older children at the table had stopped working their slate. They were watching with the careful stillness of children who knew when adult conversations required them to be absent without moving. Rosaria looked at Clay again. "You were his friend since '63, Clay said. He talked about you, Boo." She uncrossed her arms. "He said you were stubborn and difficult, and the best shot he'd ever seen, and that you had a conscience, the size of a barn, that you kept trying to fold up small enough to fit in your coat pocket." She tilted her head. "He said when you finally showed up, things would move." Clay said nothing for a moment. "Then I should have been here sooner." "Yes," Rosaria said simply. "You should have." She didn't say it with anger. She said it with the flat accuracy of someone stating a measurement. Then she moved to the stone hearth and crouched beside it. She worked her hand into the gap between the hearthstone and the wall, into a space that looked like nothing from any angle in the room, and drew out a folded canvas packet, thick with pages, tied with cord. She held it out to Evelyn. 31 men, she said. Their words. Aaron wrote what they told him word for word and read it back to them, and they marked it with their names or their sign. She looked at the packet in Evelyn's hands. "My husband is in there." What he saw in that mine. What Sterling's foreman told them about the water, and what happened to the man who complained about it. Her jaw was steady. "Get that in front of someone who can't be bought." "We will," Evelyn said. "Don't tell me you'll try," Rosaria said. "I've had enough of people trying. Tell me you'll do it, or don't tell me anything." Evelyn held her gaze. "We'll do it." Rosaria nodded once. Then she looked at Clay. "My husband was a good man," she said. "He worked that mine for 11 years. 11 years, and they killed him for knowing too much and then wrote accident in their ledger. She pressed her lips together. Make that word cost them something. It'll cost them everything, Clay said. They left the house quietly. The two older children had gone back to their slate. Outside, the lower quarter was dark, and still, the worker shacks arranged in their irregular rows along the base of the ridge like something planted rather than built. A few windows showed lantern light. A dog barked somewhere and stopped. The night air had gone cold with the speed only desert nights manage. They walked back toward the main part of town without speaking for a time. Clay carried the canvas packet under his duster. The oilskin packets were already at the house, secured. Tomorrow he'd find a way to get all of it wrapped together and ready for transport to the territorial court in Prescott. That was the first task. Get the evidence to a court that Sterling's money hadn't reached. Everything else ran through that. 31 testimonies, Evelyn said quietly. It's enough, Clay said. More than enough, with the ledger and the deed records. She pulled her shawl tighter. The problem isn't the evidence. I know. The problem is getting it out of the territory alive. She glanced sideways at him. Sterling controls the northern road. There are two other routes, the pass through Coyote Canyon, which takes 4 days on horseback, and the river road south, which is faster but exposed. I know the Coyote Canyon Pass. Of course you do. She said it without particular edge, just observation. They came back onto the main road. The company saloon was still lit at the far end, noise drifting down in the still air, voices and boot heels, and the occasional sound of glass. The rest of Main Street was dark. The windmill had slowed in the night calm, turning just barely, a faint, reluctant creak on each rotation. They were almost to Evelyn's house when the man stepped out of the shadow of the hardware store. He was wearing a deputy's badge. Deputy Harold Cutter was 45, red-faced, with a drinker's careful posture, the conscious uprightness of a man overcompensating for the effect of what he'd consumed. He wore his hat at a self-important angle and his thumbs in his belt with the studied casualness of a man who'd watched someone else do it and practiced in a mirror. He looked at Clay. You? He said. Clay stopped walking. Deputy. Cutter came down off the hardware store step. He had a folded paper in his left hand, which she opened and looked at with more ceremony than it required. Clayton. No known surname. Drifter. Currently in violation of Pima County Territorial Vagrancy Ordinance, Section 12, which requires any non-resident male, without demonstrated means of lawful employment, to vacate the county within 48 hours of arrival or face detention. He looked up from the paper with the expression of a man who expects this to conclude the conversation. Clay looked at him calmly. Harold Cutter, he said. Deputy, Rattlesnake Ridge Township, that's right. Appointed when? Cutter blinked. What? Your appointment. What date and under whose authority? Cutter's expression shifted slightly, the first sign that this was not going the way he'd anticipated. I was appointed by the Sterling Mining and Water Company, Clay said. Under provisional territorial charter, same as Grover Pike's company marshal commission. He folded his arms. Here's the issue with that, Deputy. A company charter authorizes a private security force for the protection of company property and personnel. It does not authorize the creation of a municipal law enforcement office. He paused. A municipal deputy must be appointed by the elected township council and commissioned by the county sheriff in Tucson. Do you have a county commission? Cutter opened his mouth. Because if you do, Clay continued, then the vagrancy ordinance you're citing falls under county jurisdiction, and county jurisdiction requires a 10-day notice period before removal can be enforced, not 48 hours. And if you don't have a county commission, then you have no authority to enforce any public ordinance at all. You're a private security guard with a badge, and private security guards cannot detain free citizens on public roads. The silence that followed was complete. Evelyn was watching Clay with an expression she couldn't entirely control, which was a difficult feat for a woman as controlled as she was. She'd known he was former law. She hadn't fully understood, until this moment, what that meant in practical terms. He hadn't looked up the law. He'd recited it from memory, fluently, without hesitation, in the dark, in the middle of a dusty road, to a confused deputy who was rapidly reconsidering his evening. Cutter looked at the paper in his hand. He looked at Clay. He looked at the paper again as if it might have changed. "I have my orders," he said. His voice had lost its official tone. "I don't doubt it," Clay said. "But your orders don't change the law, and the law is what I just told you it was." He met Cutter's eyes steadily. "Now, Mrs. Cross is a legal resident of this township under a property deed, filed and registered with the Territorial Recorder's Office in Tucson. That deed also establishes the commercial archive she operates, which constitutes a lawful business enterprise." He tilted his head slightly. "I am employed by that enterprise, effective as of yesterday morning, which gives me demonstrated means of lawful employment and puts me entirely outside the scope of your ordinance." Cutter stared at him. Clay looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Cross, do you confirm my employment?" Evelyn looked at Cutter. "Mr. Thorne has been retained as a security consultant for the Cross Deed and Assay Archive," she said, with the composed authority of a woman who had been filing legal documents for 9 years, and knew exactly what language sounded official. "He is compensated from the archive's operating account. I have documentation." She did not have documentation, but she could create it in about 10 minutes in her record office, and by morning it would be as real as anything else in her files. Cutter looked between them. The paper in his hand had become a liability rather than a weapon. He folded it. He put it in his coat pocket. He looked at Clay one more time with the expression of a man filing something away for later. "Mind how you go," he said, which was all he had left. He walked north. Clay watched him go. He waited until the sound of Cutter's boots had faded before he turned back toward Evelyn's house. Evelyn fell into step beside him. She waited a full 10 seconds before she spoke. "Security consultant," she said. "It'll hold," Clay said, "legally. I know it'll hold. I'm the one who said it." She paused. "You remembered all of that. The ordinance numbers, the jurisdiction rules. I wore a marshal's badge for 11 years. People wear badges for 11 years and forget the law before the ink's dry on their commission." She looked at him sideways. "You didn't forget. Forgetting seemed like a bad idea in my line of work." She almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself, but it was in the vicinity. "I'll make you a contract in the morning," she said. "A real one in the record book, with your name and a start date and a nominal wage." "I don't need a wage. You need the legal standing," she said. "So you'll take the wage and I'll record it properly, and if Cutter or anyone else wants to challenge it, they can do that in a territorial court where we'd like to be headed anyway." She looked at him. "You know how to use the law as a tool, as well as you use a gun." He considered this. "Better, most of the time," he said. "Guns make noise." They reached the house. She put the canvas packet with the others in the iron box and reset the floorboard. She was at her desk in the record office, writing up the employment contract by lamplight, when Clay came through with a cup of coffee and set it at her elbow without comment and went back out to the workshop. She sat with the coffee and the lamplight and the scratch of her pen and wrote Clayton Thorne's name into her record book, with a start date of September the 22nd and a weekly wage of $2 and the designation of security and legal consultation. She blotted the ink, looked at the name on the page. She closed the record book. The following morning arrived overcast, the sky the color of dirty wool, which in Arizona territory usually meant nothing would come of it. A high haze, dry, no rain. Clay left the house early. Evelyn watched him go from the kitchen window while she made coffee, heading south at a measured pace, not toward Main Street, but toward the Mission Road. She had a fair idea where he was going. Back to Campbell's clinic, she went to her office and opened the archive. The Cross Deed and Assay Archive had stayed open through all of it, through Sterling's first set of intimidation tactics 18 months ago. through the offers and the threats and the vandalism, and Aaron's death, through the rope yesterday and the ransacked office last night. It had stayed open because closing it was exactly what they wanted, and because the archive was the one institution in Rattlesnake Ridge that gave ordinary people a legal record of what they owned. Without it, Sterling's lawyers could rewrite ownership as easily as they rewrote assay numbers. 3 people came in that morning. A miner named Platt, wanting to confirm his claim boundary. An older Mexican woman named Senora Delgado, who came in every 3 weeks to look at the deed for her late father's land and reassure herself it was still recorded. And a young couple, newly arrived from New Mexico, wanting to register a mining claim on the ridge. Evelyn helped all 3 with the same careful attention she always gave. She was recording the young couple's claim when she heard the door. The sheriff, not Cutter, the actual sheriff, Elmore Briggs, no relation to the saloon keeper, though the town had always found this coincidence either amusing or fitting. Sheriff Briggs was a lean, disappointed-looking man in his 60s who had been an adequate lawman in his 50s and had since undergone a gradual corruption that he'd managed to convince himself was pragmatism. He was not cruel by nature. He was afraid, which, in a position of authority, amounts to roughly the same thing. He took his hat off when he came in, which was habitual. "Evelyn," he said. "Elmore." She finished her notation and set down her pen. "What can I do for you?" He turned his hat in his hands. He looked at the young couple. He looked at them with the particular expression of a man who wishes he were somewhere else. "I need a word," he said. The young couple gathered their receipt and left. Briggs sat down across from her desk without being invited. He set his hat on his knee. He looked at the record book, the files, the shelves, the general orderly industry of the archive, and he looked slightly pained by it. "That man you've taken on," he said. "Thorne, my security consultant," she said. "His employment is recorded. You're welcome to review it. I've no doubt it is." Briggs turned his hat one more rotation. "Sterling isn't pleased. Sterling isn't my employer. Evelyn," he said it with a kind of exhausted emphasis. "What happened yesterday is not going to be forgotten." "I hope not," she said. 6 men with drawn guns and a rope around a woman's neck on Main Street ought to be remembered for some time. It might discourage repetition. Briggs' jaw moved. This man Thorne came out of nowhere. Nobody knows who he is or what his business is here. "His business is my business," she said. "He's on contract. You've seen the documentation. Pike's hand is broken in 3 places. Pike put a rope around my neck," she said. "He's fortunate a broken hand is all he has to show for it." Briggs was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hat. "Sterling is going to move against this man," he said. He said it quietly, leaning slightly forward, with the lowered voice of a man saying something he probably shouldn't be saying. "Not Cutter, not Pike, not right away. He's got people coming in from Tucson. Serious people." Evelyn looked at him. This was Briggs doing the closest thing he could manage to warning her, which was a complicated gesture from a complicated man, and she received it as such. "Thank you, Elmore," she said. He stood. He put his hat on. He looked at her for a moment with his disappointed, frightened old eyes. "I don't have the authority to run him out," he said. "Cutter told me about the ordnance business last night. He's right. I don't have the standing, not with a proper contract." He paused at the door. "But I'd encourage him to be careful." "I'll pass that along," she said. Briggs left. She sat for a moment and then went back to her record book. Clay returned around noon, and she relayed what Briggs had told her while they ate. He listened without interrupting, which she had noticed was his practice. He took information in fully before he did anything with it. "Tucson," he said. "That's what Briggs said. Sterling's bringing in professionals." "Timeline?" He didn't say. "Days, probably." She set down her fork. "He wasn't warning us out of loyalty. He was warning us because if things go badly here, his name is attached to this town, and he knows it. Still useful information." "That's what I thought." He was quiet for a moment, turning something over. She'd learned to read that silence by now, 2 days in. It wasn't the silence of a man without anything to say. It was the silence of a man running figures. I need to move the evidence packet, he said. Not all of it, not yet, but a copy. Something I can get out of the territory through a route Sterling isn't watching. To a federal contact in Prescott who I trust. You have a contact there. I have a former colleague, federal circuit judge named Harlan Webb. He's old and he's irascible. And he doesn't take bribes because he genuinely doesn't need money. He looked at her. He'll receive the evidence and hold it under federal seal. Once it's in his hands, Sterling can't touch it. Can you get it to him without being intercepted? Not by writing it myself, he said. I need someone who can travel without being scrutinized. He paused. Someone Sterling's men don't have a reason to stop, she thought. Dr. Campbell sometimes sends samples to the Territorial Medical Board in Prescott. Medical courier. He has a regular arrangement with a man named Devereux who makes the run once a month. Clay looked at her. The next run is Thursday, she said. 3 days. He nodded slowly. If Campbell seals the documents inside a medical parcel, properly addressed to the Territorial Board, with a separate sealed letter, to Judge Webb Devereux doesn't open the parcels, she said. He's a courier. He delivers what he's given. Then Thursday, Clay said. She nodded. I'll speak to Campbell today. That afternoon they went to the clinic together. Not covertly this time. She was visiting a patient, which was true in the sense that she'd brought a small parcel of food contributed by Senora Delgado and 2 other women in the upper quarter who'd heard about the people in Campbell's back room. It was a thin cover, but a real one. The clinic's front room was quiet. Campbell was cleaning instruments at the basin when they came in. Clay closed the door behind them. What happened next wasn't planned. Or it was, but not by anyone in the room. Campbell drew back the curtain. The back room was fuller than it had been 2 nights ago. A man in the far corner was breathing with the particular wet labor of someone whose lungs were badly compromised. 2 children sat against the wall with blank, glassy eyes and flushed cheeks. A woman Evelyn recognized from the lower quarter, the wife of a shaft foreman, was sitting upright with her hands in her lap, staring at nothing. Clay looked at it. He took off his coat. He handed it to Evelyn without looking at her. He rolled his sleeves to the elbow. He looked at Campbell. What do you need done? He said. Campbell looked at him for half a second with the expression of a man recalibrating something. There are 2 full water buckets at the well out back, he said. Fresh water, clean well, not company supply. They need to come in. Clay went out the back. He came back with both buckets, 1 in each hand, the full weight of them, pulling at his arms and at his stitched ribs, though he didn't show the latter. He set them down where Campbell indicated. He went back for 2 more. While he hauled water, Campbell distributed it. The man with the bad lungs was given small, careful sips. The 2 feverish children were sponged down with dampened cloth. The woman with the blank stare was brought a cup, and she held it in both hands and stared into it without drinking, until the woman beside her gently guided it upward. Clay worked around the room quietly. When Campbell needed his hands free, Clay held the bowl. When a child needed to be repositioned to breathe better, Clay did it with the careful, matter-of-fact competence of a man who'd handled injured people before and knew that gentleness and efficiency were not opposing forces. Evelyn watched him. She stood near the curtain with his coat over her arm, and she watched a man who made his living with violence hold a sick child's head up from a pallet so the child could drink without choking. He was talking to the child, quietly, nothing remarkable, just a low, steady voice, keeping the child oriented, giving them something to follow back from the fever's edge. The child drank. The child settled. Clay sat back on his heels and looked at Campbell with the level, practical expression of a man, asking what's next. She looked at the coat in her hands, at the scars on his forearms where his sleeves were rolled back. At the careful, deliberate way he moved through that suffering room, taking up space without trotting on it. She'd been measuring him since he arrived. She'd been fair about it, she thought, and skeptical as she had every right to be. Trust was something she'd learned to build slowly. And with documentation, the way you built a solid deed record. Fact by fact, action by action. She added this to the record. An hour later, when they'd done what could be done, and Campbell had mixed what medicines he could compound from his depleted stores, they sat in the examination room. She gave Campbell the information about Devereux and Thursday's courier run. Campbell agreed without hesitation. "I'll prepare the package tonight," he said. "Medical board notation on the outside, sealed with my board registration stamp, and a separate interior letter for your judge." "Webb," Clay said. "Harlan Webb, Arizona Territorial Court. Prescott. Address it to him personally." Campbell wrote the name down. Clay rolled his sleeves back down. He took his coat from Evelyn. She watched him put it on. He met her eyes over the collar as he settled the coat on his shoulders. A brief look, just a moment. The kind of mutual acknowledgement that doesn't require a frame. Then he looked at Campbell. "The man in the corner," he said, "the one with the lungs." "How long?" Campbell was quiet for a moment. "A week. Maybe. 2, Clay nodded. "His family in the quarter?" "Wife. 2 grown sons who still work the mine. His sons will want to know the testimony. Their father gave Aaron as part of what goes to Prescott Thursday," Clay said. "That it'll be seen. That a federal judge will have it in his hands before the end of the month." Campbell looked at him. "You want me to tell them?" "I want you to tell him," Clay said, "while there's still time for him to hear it." Campbell was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. They went out into the late afternoon. The overcast had thinned, and the sun was pushing through in long, slanted columns of dusty gold over the ridge. The kind of light that made even a hard place look briefly like a painting. They walked north. 3 days, Evelyn said. 3 days, Clay said. She thought about men coming from Tucson. Professional men. She thought about the evidence in the iron box under her floorboard, and the 31 testimonies folded into their canvas packet, and Aaron's handwriting on a sealed oilskin, all of it representing years of careful, dangerous truth-gathering by a man who'd been methodical enough to distribute the proof across 40 households and principled enough to die for it. She thought about what Rosaria Vega had said. Make that word cost them something. She walked beside Clay through the red afternoon dust of Rattlesnake Ridge, and she thought, 3 days. Get the evidence to Webb. Then whatever came after, they'd face with something already irretrievable, already beyond Sterling's reach. That was the thing about truth, documented and delivered. Once it was in a federal judge's hands under seal, all the hired men from Tucson in the world couldn't unpaper it. Aaron had known that. Aaron had built for that outcome from the beginning. She glanced at Clay. He was watching the north end of Main Street, where the company office sat with its lit windows in the gathering dusk. Watching with that steady, architectural attention of his. She looked where he was looking. 2 men she didn't recognize were standing outside the company office, talking to Sterling's foreman. Dressed for travel, trail dust still on them. Their horses were at the hitching post. They hadn't been there this morning. Clay's pace didn't change. His expression didn't change. "That's not from Tucson," he said quietly. "That's too fast." Evelyn looked at the men again. "Who?" "I don't know yet," he said. "But I will." They kept walking. The 2 strangers at the company office were named Dodd and Renfrew. Clay found this out by morning, the way he found most things out, by being somewhere unremarkable and paying attention. He'd positioned himself on the hotel porch with a cup of coffee and a posture of absolute leisure before the sun was properly up. And by the time Main Street had its first foot traffic, he'd watched both men come out of the company office, walk to the Silver Spur for breakfast, and exchange enough information with Sterling's foreman to confirm what he'd suspected. They were advance men. Scouts sent ahead of whatever Sterling was assembling in Tucson, here to assess the situation and report back. Not killers. Not yet. Watchers. Which meant Sterling hadn't fully decided yet how far he needed to go. That was useful to know. It meant they still had a window, thin and closing, but real. Clay brought this back to Evelyn over the employment contract she'd drawn up, both of them sitting at her record office desk, while the morning light came through the cleaned window and the archive prepared to open for the day. They're here to measure the problem, Clay said. Dodd and Renfrew. They'll be sending word back to Tucson within 48 hours. Measuring the problem, Evelyn said. Meaning you. Meaning the whole situation. What evidence might exist? Who holds it? How organized the opposition is? He drank his coffee. Right now, they think the opposition is one drifter who got lucky on Main Street and a widow who won't close her office. Let them think that. For another day. Yes, she looked at the contract on the desk. Thursday is tomorrow. I know. He set down the cup. Campbell has the package ready. Devereux makes the run at first light. Once it's gone, we're in a different position. Better or worse? Both, he said honestly. Better because the evidence is beyond Sterling's reach. Worse because he'll know we've moved, and he'll stop being patient. She absorbed this. Outside, the first customer of the morning was already at the archive door, a miner with a boundary question. She could see through the window she stood. Stay visible today, she said. Let Dodd and Renfrew see you going about ordinary business. Give them nothing to take back to Tucson, except a man doing legal consulting work for a deed archive. I plan to, he said. She went to open the door. The day moved with the particular tension of a calm that both parties know is temporary. Clay sat in the archive for 2 hours, reviewing deed records she'd pulled for cross-reference, a legitimate task she'd assigned him, and one that allowed him to be seen by anyone looking through the window, doing exactly what his contract said he did. Around mid-morning, he walked to the hardware store for a replacement window latch, a small repair still needed at the archive. He nodded to Dodd, who was standing outside the barber shop, and Dodd nodded back with the careful neutrality of professional observation. At noon, he checked on Campbell. The clinic was quiet. The package for Devereux was sealed and ready, sitting in the back room inside a medical supply crate, with proper board notation on the outer wrapping. Campbell had sealed Judge Webb's letter inside a second oilskin and nestled it between the official documents in a way that would pass casual inspection. Devereux will be here at 5 tomorrow morning, Campbell said. He doesn't ask questions. Make sure he doesn't look at the outer wrapping too long before he's out of town, Clay said. He never does. He's been doing this run for 3 years. It's routine to him. Good. Keep it routine. He was back at the archive by early afternoon. Evelyn was helping Senora Delgado with a deed notation when the door opened and Toby came in. The boy was moving faster than his usual careful drift, just slightly, not running but close to it. His face was doing the controlled thing again, the thing where the urgency was in his eyes, while his body tried to look ordinary. He went to Clay, who was at the side table, with the deed files. Mr. Thorne, he said quietly. Clay looked up. Pike's men, Toby said. 2 of them went to Dr. Campbell's this morning, the back way, and this afternoon, about an hour ago, 3 of them went to the livery. He paused. They put Mr. Heck in the back room and locked it. Clay was already standing. Are you hurt? I was in the loft. They didn't see me. Toby's jaw was tight. They took someone with them when they left from the livery. Clay looked at him steadily. Who? Toby swallowed. They brought Dr. Campbell over around noon. He was walking, but he wasn't walking like himself. He paused, and they had me. They had... He stopped. His voice had gone to the edge of something. They took me out of the loft. I got away. I ran. But they still had Toby. Clay put a hand on the boy's shoulder. Slow down. Who do they still have? My mother, Toby said. She came to bring me lunch at the livery, and they were there and they took her instead. The archive went quiet. Senora Delgado had stopped moving at the counter. Evelyn had turned from her desk. Clay looked at Toby for one more second, making sure the boy was physically uninjured, which he appeared to be. Then he looked at Evelyn. She was already standing. The careful composure of her face doing what it always did under pressure, setting hard and clear. Sterling, she said. Sterling, Clay said. A note arrived at the archive door 20 minutes later, delivered by a boy younger than Toby, who'd been handed a coin and a folded paper somewhere on Main Street and told to bring it here. The boy ran as soon as Evelyn took the paper from him. She read it. She handed it to Clay without speaking. The handwriting was Pike's, labored with his non-dominant left hand, the letters uneven. The message was short. Bring the remaining affidavits from Aaron Cross's files to the old timber mill at Devil's Chasm by nightfall. Come alone. The doctor and the boy's mother. Come home unhurt when the papers are in our hands. If you bring the drifter, the trade is off, and so are the hostages. You know what that means. Clay read it. Twice. He set it on the desk. No? He said. Evelyn looked at him. The trade is fabricated, he said. Sterling has no intention of returning anyone. If you bring the affidavits, he has what he wants, and 2 witnesses to eliminate. If you don't bring them, he still eliminates the witnesses. He looked at the note. The note exists to move you, to get you to Devil's Chasm, where he controls the terrain. I know that, she said. Her voice was level. I know that, Clay. I also know that Dr. Campbell is 60 years old and Toby's mother has 4 children. She looked at him directly. We can't not go. He looked back at her. He'd known that was coming. He'd have said the same. We go, he said, but we go prepared and we go my way. What's your way? Not the front road. There's a secondary trail to Devil's Chasm that comes in from the East Ridge. It's longer and it's rough, but it approaches the mill from the uphill side. We get there before nightfall. We see the ground before they expect us. He paused. And we don't bring the affidavits. They'll know. They'll know when we arrive, which is after we've seen what we're walking into. He picked up the note again. Pike wrote this. He's injured. His right hand is destroyed. He's managing this operation at reduced capacity and with reduced patience. Set it down. Impatient men make predictable decisions. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She looked at Toby, who was sitting on a chair against the wall, his hands in his lap. He was 10 years old, and he'd run through this town with his mother taken and found the right person to tell. She looked at him for a moment with an expression she didn't bother to conceal. Toby, she said, you did well. You did exactly right. She crouched to his level. I need you to go to Rosaria Vega's house right now and stay there until I come for you. Can you do that? Toby looked at her, then at Clay. Is my mother going to be all right? He said. Clay looked at him. He could have offered the reassurance that cost him to say and nothing to deliver. He didn't. I'm going to do everything I can, he said. That's the truth of it. Toby held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, stood up, and went out the door. They prepared fast. Clay went to the workshop and came back with his rifle and 2 additional boxes of ammunition and a coil of rope. He took the oilskin packets from the iron box under the floorboard and handed them to Evelyn. Take these to Campbell's clinic, he said. Put them in the hearthstone gap where the canvas packet was. He paused. If anything goes wrong tonight, those don't leave through the front door. We're trusting that gap to hold them. We're trusting that Sterling's men won't search the clinic thoroughly while he has 2 hostages at Devil's Chasm. And his attention is pointed west. He checked his revolver, reloaded it, holstered it. He can't be everywhere. She took the packets. She looked at the iron box, empty now. I'm coming with you, she said. I know. She looked up, having expected an argument. You speak Spanish, he said. If Rosario's right about the miners who gathered testimony for Aaron, some of them are at that mill tonight because Sterling made them move the powder kegs. Those men aren't enemies. He checked the rifle, and Campbell will need someone he trusts when we get him out. She took the packets to the clinic, hid them in the gap, exchanged a look with the 1 volunteer nurse who was in the clinic that afternoon, a young woman named Petra who Campbell had been quietly training. She told Petra what she could without telling her everything. Petra's expression went still and focused. I'll keep the clinic, she said. If we're not back by morning, send for Rosaria Vega. She went back to the archive, changed into darker clothes, put on her riding boots, and took Aaron's small belt knife from the drawer where it had lived for 6 months. She buckled it on without ceremony. Clay had the horses ready at the back of the property. Not the dun alone. He'd arranged a second horse from the livery through a miner he'd spoken with the day before, a transaction conducted quietly enough that neither Dodd nor Renfrew had observed it. They rode east. The trail to Devil's Chasm from the East Ridge was exactly what Clay had described. Rough, steep in sections, threading through loose shale and stands of ocotillo that reached for them in the declining light. They didn't push the horses faster than the terrain allowed. A lamed horse, 2 miles from the chasm, would be a serious problem. Evelyn rode well. Clay had observed this without surprise. A woman who'd spent 9 years in Arizona territory and still lived on the edge of things either learned to ride or made a series of steadily worse decisions. They didn't talk much on the trail. The light was going fast in that way it does in the desert. The sun not so much setting as retreating with urgency, leaving the sky a violent red behind the western ridges and everything under it going blue and dark. Devil's Chasm was a natural cut in the limestone ridge, maybe 80 yards long and 40 deep, carved by water that had stopped caring about this place 1,000 years ago. The old timber mill sat at the chasm's western end, a substantial structure, once, now half collapsed, its wheel broken, its walls standing but soft with rot, its interior, a skeleton of beams and rotted planking over the drop of the chasm itself. They came in from the eastern shelf, above and behind the mill, and tied the horses at the base of a limestone outcrop, where a cut in the rock hid them from the mill's sightlines. Clay went forward on foot. He was gone 11 minutes. He came back moving faster than he'd left. "It's worse than I thought," he said. He crouched beside her in the shadow of the limestone. "They've packed the interior of the mill with black powder kegs. I counted 8 from the east window, maybe more toward the front." He looked at her. "Pike has a fuse line running from the main powder stack to a position in the side gully, where one man with a torch can set it off from cover." Evelyn looked at him. He was never going to negotiate. No. Whatever we brought or didn't bring, the plan was to fire the mill. Take out the hostages. Take out whoever came for them, and write it as an accident. Bad powder storage, unstable structure. He shook his head. "The worker shacks on the north side of the mill, they're close enough to catch debris from a blast that size." She thought of the families in those shacks. "Campbell and Toby's mother," she said. "Where are they?" "Inside the mill. East corner, away from the main kegs. They're bound." He paused. 4 gunmen inside. "Pike's in the side gully with the fuse man. 6 total, 6, she thought. "The torch man has to be your priority. If he lights the fuse, everything else stops mattering." Clay was looking at the mill. "I go in from the east roof. There's enough rotten planking that I can get to the torchman's position through the side without crossing the open ground. And the 4 inside? I need time." He looked at her. "I need someone to draw their attention to the front approach long enough to give me the roof." She understood what he was saying. "I won't be standing in the open," she said. It was not a question. "There's a limestone shelf at the front, low to the ground. You call from there, voice only. Tell them you're there for the trade, that you have the affidavits." He met her eyes. "When they hear your voice, they'll move toward the front windows and the door. That's when I move. How long do you need?" 4 minutes, maybe 5. She held his gaze. She wanted to say something about the reliability of this plan, about the margin it left and the number of things that could interrupt it. She knew what he'd say back. He'd say that this was what was available, that ideal options weren't on offer in Devil's Chasm tonight, that the alternative was standing here until the fuse man moved on his own timeline. 4 minutes, she said. Try for 5. They moved. She circled the long way around to the front approach, staying low, staying off the loose shale that would announce her. The limestone shelf was exactly where he'd said, a natural low barrier 20 yards from the mill's front wall, waist high and solid. She pressed against it, She could see the mill's front clearly in the last light. Two windows, both dark. A door hanging open, faint movement inside. Shadows. Shifting, she counted to 60. Gave Clay his head start. Then she called out, "I'm here." Her voice went out across the chasm, flat, clear, and steady. "I have what you want, I came alone. Show me the doctor and the woman, and we'll make the trade." Silence for 3 seconds. Then a lantern appeared in the nearest window. Then another. Voices inside, moving toward the front. She could hear boots on the rotted floor, the creak and complaint of the planking, as men shifted weight toward the sound of her. She kept talking. "I want to see them standing," she said. "Both of them at the door, before anything changes hands. That's my condition." She paused. "Pike can hear me fine. I'm talking to Pike." Movement at the door. A figure. Another behind it. She was watching the door and the windows, and she was counting. 1 minute, 2, not thinking about what was happening on the east roof, not thinking about Clay moving across rotted planking above 8 kegs of black powder, because thinking about that would make her voice change, and she needed her voice to stay exactly where it was. "Where are the papers?" a voice from inside called. "Not Pike." "One of the gunmen." "They're with me," she said. "Where's the doctor?" A scuffle at the door. Then a shape, unmistakably Campbell, pushed to the opening, his hands bound in front of him. He was squinting into the dark outside, trying to find her. "Evelyn," he said. "Her name? Just her name." She heard what was in it and kept her face still. "I see him," she said. "I want to see the woman." 3 minutes. "She needed another 2, you said." "Alone," the voice called. "Sterling says you brought the drifter." "Sterling says a lot of things," she said. "Most of them are lies, and everyone in this territory knows it. I came alone because those are the terms I was given, and I don't break my terms." She let a beat pass. "Can Sterling say the same?" A silence. Movement inside, the shuffle of men consulting. 4 minutes. "Come on, Clay." "I'm walking toward the door," she said. She didn't move. She just said it, to create the impression of motion, to give them something to track. "I want to see." The shot came from inside the mill, from the east side, above, not at her. It was followed immediately by a shout that cut off abruptly, and then by 2 more shots in fast sequence, and then by a sound she could not identify immediately. A heavy thud, something structural, a beam or a section of floor giving way. The gunmen at the front windows reacted. They moved back into the mill toward the sound. She was up and moving before they'd taken 2 steps. She came in through the door low and fast, and the first thing she saw was Campbell against the east wall, still standing, and Toby's mother Maria crouched beside him, and both of them whole and alive. The 4 gunmen were in disarray. 2 moving toward the east end, 1 turned toward the door, looking directly at her, 1 scrambling for his weapon from where he'd set it down. The one looking at her hesitated half a second, which was a significant donation. She drove Aaron's belt knife across his gun hand. Not deep enough. He dropped the weapon and swore, and she kicked it away and got between him and it, and put the limestone wall at her back. From the east end of the mill came the unmistakable sounds of a close-quarters fight. Clay and 1 or more of the gunmen in the dark and the debris. She couldn't see it. She was watching the man in front of her, and the one scrambling for the dropped gun, and the 2 who'd gone toward the east, and the fuse and the torch. The fuse. She hadn't heard an explosion. She hadn't heard an explosion, which meant either the fuse hadn't been lit, or Clay had reached the torchman first. She was working out the probability of this when the world gave her a different problem. The shot came from the side gully, not aimed at her. Aimed into the mill at Clay, from outside through the gap in the east wall where the planking had rotted through. And in the chaos of the moment's geometry, she watched Clay take a step, and then take the bullet, and saw the way it hit him, across the ribs on his left side, not center mass, but enough the force of it, turning him half around at the edge of the chasm drop. The torch man in the gully dropped his torch toward the fuse with a shout that might have been triumph or might have been panic. She couldn't tell which. Clay went, over the edge, not falling, exactly. He grabbed the lip as he went. She saw that much. His right hand catching stone, slowing it. But the damaged ribs and the momentum and the dark were against him, and then he was gone over the limestone, drop into the dry wash below. The torch hit the fuse line, and the fuse caught. It sputtered and hissed and burned orange in the dark. She looked at it. She looked at Campbell and Maria against the east wall. She looked at the three gunmen still between her and the rest of the mill. The fuse burned toward the powder stack with the steady, indifferent urgency of fire doing its one job. She didn't think about Clay. She couldn't. Not right now. Not in this particular second. She pulled Aaron's knife and cut toward the east wall where the fuse entered the mill through a gap in the rotted boards. She went on her knees and dragged the blade across the fuse line 2 feet from where it entered the building, cutting it clean through. The external section kept burning. It would burn out in the gully, reaching nothing. The internal section went dark. She crouched on the floor of the old mill, breathing, the knife still in her hand. The cut fuse lying in 2 pieces in the dirt. The ceiling above her had developed a long crack down its center from the structural damage of the fight above, and dust and grit rained steadily down from it. In the lantern light, the mill groaned. The whole east end of it was becoming uncertain. Campbell was already pulling at his bound wrists. "Leave the bindings," she said. "I'll cut them outside. We have to move." The gunmen were in various states of damage and confusion. The 2 from the east end were not visible. The man she'd disarmed was cradling his hand against the far wall. The one who'd scrambled for the dropped gun had the gun but was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man reconsidering the structural soundness of his current shelter. She got Campbell and Maria to the door. She cut the bindings on the open ground outside. Campbell looked back at the mill, then at the chasm. "Clay," he said. "I know," she said. She was already moving toward the east rim of the chasm, toward the drop, toward the dry wash below. The mill's east wall gave a deep, structural groan behind her. The ceiling crack widened in the lantern light, and somewhere below the limestone rim, in the darkness of the dry wash, there was either a man still fighting to live, or there wasn't, and she needed to know which. She went over the rim. The east wall of Devil's Chasm dropped 30 feet to the dry wash below. Evelyn went down it the way the terrain allowed, not climbing so much as controlled descent, using the limestone shelves and the scrub root systems that jutted from the rock face as hand and footholds. The stone was cold under her palms and rough enough to grip. She moved fast, and she moved carefully, because fast and careless on a rock face in the dark was how you joined the person you were looking for. Above her, the mill groaned again. A section of the east wall gave way with a sound like a gunshot, debris raining down past her into the wash. She pressed flat against the rock and let it pass. Then she kept moving. The dry wash at the bottom was pale sand and loose gravel, white enough in the moonlight to navigate by. She dropped the last 6 feet and landed in a crouch, steadied herself, and looked both ways along the wash. West. She went west, toward where he would have hit, if the trajectory from the east wall was what she'd seen. 40 feet along, she found the blood, dark on the pale gravel, enough of it to be serious, a trail rather than a pool, which meant he'd moved. She followed it. The trail went another 20 feet, and then angled toward the base of the Kedsem wall, where a narrow crevice opened in the limestone, barely wider than a man's shoulders, running back into the rock, perhaps 8 or 10 feet. She crouched at the opening clay. Silence for 2 seconds. Then, here, she went in. The crevice opened slightly at its interior end into a rough alcove, a natural pocket in the stone just tall enough to sit upright in. He was sitting against the back wall, with his right knee drawn up and his left arm pressed tight against his ribs. His face in the moonlight, filtering through the crevice opening, was the color of old chalk. She got in beside him. Close quarters. The alcove didn't allow for anything else. She put her hand on his jaw first, a quick check eyes, responsiveness. He tracked her. Present. Let me see the ribs, she said. I cut it. The fuse is out. Campbell and Maria are above. They're clear. She was already working at his coat, getting it open. The mill's east wall is compromised. There may be men still inside. Maybe, he said, which meant he'd handled what he could before going over the edge. She got the coat open. His shirt on the left side was soaked through, the dark flannel gone black and heavy with blood. She worked the shirt up from his belt. The bullet had gone across the left rib cage, below the armpit, a lateral track, rather than a penetrating wound. Deep graze, possibly a cracked rib beneath it. But the bullet had not entered the chest cavity. She knew what a chest wound sounded like when a man breathed, the wet, collapsed sound of it, and his breathing was clear, labored and painful. Clear through? And through, he said. Lateral track. It didn't penetrate. She pressed her palm flat against the wound to assess the bleeding. Active, but not arterial. You're going to keep what's inside you. He exhaled slowly through his nose. She pulled her shawl off and folded a section of it into a compress. She pressed it hard against the wound and took his right hand and put it over the compress. Hold that. Hard. He held it. She tore a long strip from the lower section of her shawl, working fast, and used it to bind the compress in place, wrapping it twice around his torso and knotting it tight enough to maintain pressure. He breathed carefully through the process and didn't make a sound, which told her the pain was considerable, and he was managing it the way he managed most things, by deciding to. The torchman, she said, working. In the gully. Dealt with, Clay said. Before the shot. A pause. Someone else. In the gully. I didn't see him in time, Pike, she said. Had to be Pike. He considered this. Left-handed shot at distance in the dark. He's adapting faster than I expected. You went over the edge of a 30-foot drop and crawled into a crevice, she said. I'd say you're adapting too. He almost said something. He stopped himself. She tied off the binding, checked the tension, checked his face. Still present, still tracking, but the chalk color was deepening toward something grayer, and she didn't like what that meant for the next few hours. Can you stand, she said. Yes. Can you stand without me asking you a second time whether you're sure? He looked at her. Probably. She helped him up. It required more of her weight than she'd anticipated. His left side almost entirely non-functional, the damaged ribs refusing to carry load. She got his right arm over her shoulders, and they navigated the crevice back out into the wash. Above them, the mill was quiet. No more structural sounds. Either it had settled or what was going to fall had fallen. We can't go back up the east face, she said. Not with you like this. Wash runs south, he said, quarter-mile, to where it opens onto the Mission Road flats. She knew the area. That's a mile and a half back to town on the Mission Road. Yes. She looked at him. She looked at the wash running south into the dark. She calculated what she had, which was his weight, her strength, a quarter-mile of rough wash, and then a mile and a half of open road. She calculated what she didn't have, which was time, horses, backup, and anything resembling a comfortable option. South, she said. They moved. It was slow going. The wash was loose gravel, and occasional boulders and dry brush that caught at their boots, and Clay was managing his own weight by somewhere between half and 2/3, the rest on her. He didn't apologize for it. She didn't ask him to. Apologies would have required energy. Neither of them had to spare. She focused on the ground ahead, one section at a time. The next 5 feet, then the next. The moon was high enough to give working light, which was the one piece of fortune the evening had offered. After 10 minutes, his breathing changed slightly. She felt it through his arm on her shoulders. Not the injury itself. Something else. A change in how he was holding himself. A rigidity that was different from pain management. Talk to me, she said. I'm fine. That's not talking to me. She kept moving. Where did you grow up? A pause. Tennessee. Where in Tennessee? Small place, east of Knoxville. You wouldn't know it. Try me. He told her the name of it. She didn't know it, but he talked, which was the point. She asked him about Tennessee, and he answered, sparsely at first, and then with more detail, the particular detail that surfaces when a person is tired enough, that the wall they keep between themselves and their history develops gaps. He talked about the mountain country east of Knoxville, about his father's workshop, about a creek that ran cold and clear even in August because it came down from high elevation. He talked with the flat, honest cadence of a man telling the truth about a place he'd loved before the war took him away from it, and the years after prevented his return. She listened and kept moving, and kept track of his color and his breathing, and the way his weight shifted against her, which told her more than his words. They came out of the wash onto the Mission Road flats. The road was pale in the moonlight, straight and open. In the distance, the lights of Rattlesnake Ridge. In the near distance, nothing. She stood at the edge of the road and listened for horses or voices. Nothing, they walked. 1.5 miles. She had made that walk in 18 minutes on an ordinary day. Tonight, it was going to take twice that. It took 34 minutes. They came in on the south end of town, past the darkened Mission building, and along the Mission Road proper, where the clinic sat with its small, steady lantern in the front window. Evelyn aimed for it without discussion. Petra opened the door before they reached it. She took one look and pulled the door wide. In here, the examination table. Getting him onto the table was a cooperative problem. He couldn't use his left side, and the table was the wrong height for what she needed to do with his legs. Petra understood practical medicine in the way of someone trained by a good doctor, which meant she saw the problem and solved it without being asked, dragging a stool under his knees to keep him level. Evelyn went to the basin and washed the blood off her hands. Her hands were steady. She noticed this as a fact, the way you notice things about yourself when there's no time to feel them. She went back to the table. She worked alongside Petra for the next 40 minutes. The compress held and the binding had done its job. The bleeding slowed to manageable. The cracked rib, which was what she suspected, and what a careful prod confirmed, with his sharp intake of breath, was not displaced. Painful, restricting, not immediately dangerous if he didn't do anything catastrophic with the next several days, which was, she knew, a significant conditional. She cleaned the wound properly, applied what antiseptic Campbell had left in the cabinet, stitched the deepest section of the lateral track with the careful, even stitches she'd used 2 days ago on his shoulder, working by lamplight, feeling him breathe in controlled measures beneath her hands. He was awake throughout, feverish, not badly, not yet, but the beginning of it was there in the elevated heat of his skin and the occasional second where his focus seemed to slide and then return. Campbell, he said, while she worked. Above ground and intact, she said. I told you. Her to. A pause. At Rosaria's house. I sent him there before we left. He was quiet for a moment. The east wall of the mill. I don't know about the mill, she said. I know about you, and I know about the people I was responsible for getting out. The mill's a problem for daylight. He didn't push it. She tied off the last stitch, sat back on the low stool beside the table, and pressed her hands flat on her thighs for a moment. The lamp on the side table was burning lower. Petra had gone to the back room to check on the patients there. She looked at his face. He was looking at the ceiling. The gray eyes were more gray than usual. The color things go in low light and fever. His jaw was tight with the work of keeping the pain at a useful distance. There's a cave, he said. Or there was. East of the Mission Road, 1/2 mile up the ridge. My father and I used to camp in rock shelter country like this. She realized he was still following the thread she'd given him on the walk, still talking about Tennessee, still keeping himself present. Tell me about your father, she said. He did. He talked slowly, with long pauses between thoughts. His father had been a carpenter and a serious man and a Methodist in the way of people who'd grown up believing it and never stopped without ever becoming loud about it. He'd taught Clay to shoot because the hills required it, and he'd taught him to read because he believed it was the difference between a man and a post, and he'd taught him to build things with his hands, because he thought a man who couldn't make something useful was only half finished. He died in '64, Clay said. While I was still in it, my mother wrote me when she could, but the mail was unreliable that year. A pause. I got 6 letters at once in the spring. One of them told me he was gone. The other 5 were written while he was still alive. He said it with the flat, precise grief of a man who'd carried the fact so long it had worn smooth. She looked at him. Aaron knew, he said, about my father. He was one of 3 people who did, out there, and he didn't say anything consoling about it, which was the right choice. He kept on. He kept treating me exactly the same. A pause. That was what Aaron did. He kept treating people the same, regardless of what they were carrying. The lamp guttered in a draft from the door. She had been quiet for a while, just letting him talk, and the talking had brought the fever down a degree or 2 in the last 30 minutes. Or it had seemed to. That happened sometimes, the body using the work of speech to pull back from the edge of whatever it was working itself towards. He turned his head slightly to look at her. You cut the fuse, he said. Yes, you did that with men between you and it. There were 3 of them, she said. They were disoriented. It wasn't as remarkable as you're making it. He looked at her steadily. It was exactly as remarkable as I'm making it. She looked back at him. She didn't argue it further. His eyes closed briefly, opened again. I'm going to sleep, he said. Not because of the fever, because I've been awake for 21 hours, and the wound is stable, and there's nothing productive I can do between now and morning. That's accurate, she said. Wake me at first light. I need to know about the mill and about Pike before Dodd and Renfrew send their report to Tucson. I'll wake you. And the Devereaux Courier. Thursday morning, tomorrow morning, she said. It's already Thursday. He absorbed this. Thursday. Devereaux at 5 in the morning. The package in the medical supply crate. Judge Webb's name on a sealed letter inside an oilskin, inside a legitimate courier parcel already on its way out of the territory while they'd been in the dark at Devil's Chasm. Or it should be. She needed to confirm it. She looked at Petra, who'd come back from the side room. The courier package, Evelyn said. Devereaux. Did he come? 4:50 this morning, Petra said. Dr. Campbell prepared it last night. Devereaux took it without looking at anything, and was on the road before 5. Evelyn looked at the lamp. The package was gone. In transit. On its way to Prescott and Harlan Webb and the territorial court where Sterling's money had not, as far as Clay's information held, reached. She stayed with that for a moment. She looked at Clay. His eyes were closed. His breathing had leveled to the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man forcing sleep as a practical measure. The fever was still there. She could see it in the flush across his jaw, but it wasn't climbing. The stitches were holding. The compress was holding. He was, by the narrowest reasonable margin, going to be all right. She pulled the straight-back chair from the corner and sat beside the examination table. She had not planned to stay. There were things to do. The horses, still tied at the limestone outcrop, east of the chasm. Campbell and Maria, who needed to be accounted for. The question of what Pike and whoever remained of his crew had done after the mill, and where they'd gone. She made a mental list of all of it. She stayed. It was around 2 in the morning when the fever broke properly, sweat replacing the dry heat, his color moving from chalk gray back towards something that suggested continued circulation. She changed the compress on the wound. She checked the stitches. She put a damp cloth on his forehead, and he stirred, and she took it away because she'd done it reflexively, and he didn't need it anymore. He opened his eyes, looked at her. She was aware, suddenly, of how close the chair was to the table. The logistics of the small room had placed it that way, Petra needing space to move on the other side, the lamp needing to be at an angle. It was simply geometry. His face in the lamplight was open in a way she hadn't seen it before. The fever had done what weariness and injury do. It had taken the careful management down to something more fundamental. He was looking at her without the usual measured distance, the trained economy of a man who gave away as little as possible. He looked, for just this moment, like a man who was tired of carrying things alone. She had felt that specific tiredness herself, every day for 6 months. She recognized it, the way you recognize a place you've been. "You're still here," he said. "I said I'd wake you at first light. It's not first light." "No," she said. "It's not." He was quiet for a moment. "In '63, he said, "at Chattanooga. Aaron sat up with me 3 nights running when I had the river fever. He didn't have to. There were other men who needed tending." A pause. "I asked him later why he stayed. He said sitting with someone is the simplest and most serious thing one person can do for another." She looked at him. "He was right," Clay said. She looked at the lamp, at her hands on her knees, at the crack in the adobe wall above the window where the plaster had pulled away from the frame. There were things she could say. She was aware of them, aware of the shape of the conversation they were in, aware of the particular weight and warmth that had been building since the feed store behind Main Street, since the kitchen table and the morning coffee, since the back door swinging clean on its repaired hinge. She was also a careful woman, a woman who had learned the difference between the real thing and its convincing approximation, who had been loved well once and knew what it cost when you got it wrong. She looked back at him. "When this is over," she said, "when the evidence is in Webb's hands and Sterling is in front of a federal court, and this town has its water rights back." She paused. "What do you do?" He held her gaze. "I don't know yet." That's an honest answer. "I'm trying," he said, "to stop giving you the other kind." She looked at him for a long moment. She reached out and put her hand briefly on his, the one resting on the examination table, warm from the broken fever. A moment. Then she withdrew it and sat back. "Sleep," she said. "I mean it. You're no use to anyone running on fever and no hours." He closed his eyes. She sat in the chair. Outside, the desert night was doing its gradual, imperceptible work of becoming morning. The stars were still full and present. The windmill on the edge of the clinic property turned in a light south wind. Its sound different from the one in town, smoother, better maintained, turning without the grieving creak of the municipal mill. She thought about what came next. Sterling would know about Devil's Chasm by now. He'd know the mill hadn't gone as planned. He'd know the hostages were out and alive. He'd know the fuse had been cut, and that meant someone had been in position to cut it, which meant their plan had been anticipated rather than reacted to, which would tell him something uncomfortable about the intelligence on his side. He would move quickly now. Patience was no longer in his interest. They needed Clay functional. They needed the miners rallied. They needed whatever remained of Pike's crew accounted for. They needed to know what Dodd and Renfrew had communicated to Tucson, and how long before the response arrived. She built the list in her head with the methodical attention to difficult deed work, assigning weight to each item, ordering them by urgency and dependency. It was what Aaron would have done. She pressed her lips together briefly. She had been carrying his absence every day like a stone in her coat, heavy enough to feel, but familiar enough that she'd stopped registering it as weight and started registering it as just the way moving felt. It occurred to her in the quiet of the pre-dawn clinic that the stone had shifted. Still there, always there, but shifted. Aaron had sent Clay. He had written that letter 14 months ago, knowing she believed exactly who would show up and what it would mean. He had been that kind of thorough, that kind of deliberate, that kind of insightful about people he loved and trusted. She thought, "You knew what you were sending, didn't you?" The lamp burned lower. She let it. At 4:30, Campbell came in through the back. He'd been home, she learned, had walked Maria back to her house with the 2 miners who'd emerged from the chaos at the mill still upright, had seen to his own hands, which were abraded from the rope bindings, and had come to check on his clinic and his patient. He looked at Clay on the table. He looked at the stitching. "Good work," he said quietly. "He taught me what I know," she said. sitting with someone when they need it. Campbell looked at her. He had the particular expression of a physician who has spent 50 years reading people through symptoms and had gotten very accurate at it. He put a hand briefly on her shoulder. Then he went to check on the people in the back room. At 5 in the morning, the first gray light came over the eastern ridge. Evelyn stood and stretched her back and looked at Clay. "It's first light," she said. He opened his eyes immediately. He'd been awake for at least the last 20 minutes. She'd known it from the change in his breathing. She hadn't said anything. She'd let him have the pretense of sleep for a few more minutes. He sat up slowly. The effort cost him, and he paid it without comment. He looked at the window, at the gray light, at her face. "Devereaux," he said. "Gone at 5 yesterday morning," she said. "Package confirmed, delivered to courier." He absorbed this. Something moved across his face. Not relief exactly. Something quieter than that. The crossing one critical item off a list he'd been keeping since he arrived. "All right," he said. He put his feet on the floor. She handed him his coat. The morning after Devil's Chasms at Rattlesnake Ridge woke up knowing something had changed. Nobody could have said exactly how they knew. The town had no telegraph except the one in Sterling's company office, and the events at the chasm had happened in the dark 3 miles out. But word moves through a frightened place the way water moves through cracked stone, finding every gap, reaching every low point. And by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, the story was already in pieces across every kitchen table in the lower quarter. The mill, the powder kegs, the hostages out alive, and the drifter reported dead or near it, depending on who you asked and what they'd heard from whom. Clay heard the last part when Toby showed up at the clinic door at 6 in the morning with a covered plate of cornbread from Rosaria Vega's kitchen, and the information that 2 of Sterling's men had spent the previous hour going door to door in the lower quarter, telling anyone who'd listened that the man called Thorne had gone over the chasm wall and wouldn't be getting up. Clay sat on the edge of the examination table and ate the cornbread and considered this. "Let them say it," he told Toby. Toby looked at him with the boy's precise, measuring eyes. Clay was visibly injured, his left side bound tight under his shirt, moving with the careful economy of a man working around something that hurt considerably. He was also sitting upright, eating cornbread, and thinking clearly, which Toby appeared to find sufficient. "My mother's all right," Toby said. "It wasn't quite a question. She's home," Clay said. "She walked home herself." Toby nodded once. He looked at the covered plate he'd delivered. "Rosaria sent extra." "Go get Evelyn," Clay said. "She's in the back." Evelyn was in the back room helping Petra with the morning rounds, the morning medicines, the morning water. She came when Toby found her, and she sat on the stool beside the table, and they ate Rosaria's cornbread in the early quiet of the clinic and talked through what the day required. The list was substantial. Pike's remaining crew needed accounting. The men who'd walked out of the mill, those who could walk, had dispersed into the night, and their current positions were unknown. Dodd and Renfrew were still in town, still watching, still sending back to Tucson. The evidence packet was in transit toward Prescott, which was the one fixed and favorable point on the map. But transit meant days, and days meant Sterling had time to act before Webb received anything. Clay set down the empty plate. "I need to speak with Campbell," he said, "before he opens the clinic." "He's in the examination room," Evelyn said. Campbell came in when she called him, still in his canvas apron, carrying a small bottle he'd been labeling. He looked at Clay with the professional assessment of a physician reviewing a patient who'd been ambulatory when they should have been horizontal, which Clay clearly was. "You shouldn't be sitting up," Campbell said. "I'm sitting up," Clay said. "Tell me about the evidence." Campbell set the bottle on the side table. He looked at both of them. "There's something I haven't told you," he said, "about Aaron's records." They waited. Campbell sat down in the chair Evelyn had occupied through the night. He looked at his ink-stained hands for a moment, not hesitating, just ordering the information. "Aaron came to me 3 times in the last month before he died," Campbell said. The first time with the oilskin packet. The second time to discuss the testimonies he was gathering. The third time he paused. The third time he came in the evening and he was agitated in a way I hadn't seen him. He told me that the ledger, the water diversion records, the forged assay metrics, the comprehensive financial proof, he had not kept it in one place. Clay looked at him. He told me he'd broken it apart, Campbell said, not destroyed it, distributed it. He took the figures, the measurements, the dates, the transaction records, and he transcribed them onto whatever paper was available. Invoice slips, clinic receipts, medical debt records. He looked up. He gave those papers to 40 different minor families in the lower quarter, filed them among their own household documents, their own receipts, the ordinary paper clutter of working people's lives. The room was quiet. He told each family the paper was a personal medical record, Campbell said. Something to keep safe and private. Most of them don't read well enough to know. It wasn't. He paused. He said he did it because a single notebook could be found and destroyed. 40 pieces of paper in 40 different homes, mixed in with 40 families' ordinary lives, could survive anything short of burning the entire quarter to the ground. Evelyn looked at the wall. She was thinking about Aaron, about his specific, thorough, infuriating brilliance, about the way he solved problems at the deepest structural level rather than the surface one. He told you this, Clay said. He told me the system, Campbell said. He told me which families had which pieces. He wrote it down. He reached into the pocket of his canvas apron and produced a small folded paper. This is the key. Which family holds which section of the record? He held it out. Clay took it. He unfolded it. He read it carefully, then folded it, and looked at Campbell. Does anyone else know this exists? No one living, Campbell said. Sterling doesn't know the evidence is distributed. He knows the ledger was never found, Campbell said. He's assumed it was hidden whole, in one location. That's why his men have been searching in concentrated efforts. Aaron's house, the clinic, the archive. He looked at Clay steadily. He's been looking for a notebook. He doesn't know he's looking for 40 pieces of paper in 40 coat pockets. Clay sat with this for a moment. Evelyn was watching him. She could see the shift in his thinking, the way the whole problem reorganized itself around this new information. The evidence wasn't vulnerable because it wasn't centralized. It was already, in the most practical sense, beyond Sterling's reach. Destroying it would require destroying an entire community's personal records, and doing that openly would itself constitute the kind of evidence that federal courts noticed. Aaron had not hidden the proof. He had woven it into the fabric of the people it was meant to protect. We need to gather it, Clay said. Carefully, Campbell said, and without making the gathering visible to Sterling's watchers. How many of the 40 families are still in the quarter? Evelyn said. 37 when I last counted, Campbell said. 3 have already left the territory. The pieces those 3 families had, Clay said. Duplicated, Campbell said. Aaron was thorough. The key sections of the record have 2 copies each, held by different families. The 3 who left were holding secondary copies only. They looked at each other. Evelyn thought. Of course he duplicated the critical sections. Of course he did. Tonight, Clay said. We start gathering tonight. Quietly, house by house, through people the families already trust. He looked at Evelyn. You know these families, most of them, she said. The ones who've filed deeds or claims through the archive. I know by name, several others through the clinic visits. And Rosaria, Campbell said. She knows everyone in the quarter. Has for years. Clay nodded. He started to stand and caught himself, his left side, reminding him sharply of its current limitations. He settled back. You're not walking the lower quarter tonight, Evelyn said. I'm aware. You're going to stay here and rest, and Rosaria and I will go. He looked at her. She looked back with the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is now simply informing the relevant parties. Take Toby, he said. He knows which houses have back doors and which dogs will announce you, she almost smiled. I'll take Toby. They spent the morning at the clinic, mostly in the examination room, Clay on the table, because Campbell was insistent, and because his ribs were making a persuasive argument of their own. Evelyn sat at the small desk and worked on the list from Campbell's key, cross-referencing it against her archive records, building a picture of which families she knew, which Rosaria knew, which would require a stranger to approach, and what the approach should be. It was document work. She was good at it. Around mid-morning, a man came to the clinic's front door. Not a patient, one of the miners from the night before. The young one with the Mexican accent and the bad cough she'd seen in the street the day Clay arrived. His name, she learned now, was Esteban Flores. He stood in the clinic doorway and looked past Petra to where Evelyn was visible at the desk. "I heard what happened at the chasm," he said. "My cousin was there. He was one of Sterling's men who moved the powder kegs." He looked at the floor. He didn't know what it was for. He thought it was ordinary supply work. "Is your cousin all right?" Evelyn asked. "He ran when the shooting started. He's home." Flores turned his hat in his hands. The hat was worn through at the crown. "I wanted to say, to whoever is doing this," he stopped. "Started again. My father worked this mine for 8 years. He's in the ground in the lower quarter cemetery from the lung rot." Sterling's company wrote natural causes in their report. He looked up. "There's nothing natural about dying because a company decided ventilation systems cost too much." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. "Your father's name?" she said. "Marcos Flores. He gave a testimony to Aaron Cross." Flores looked surprised. "I didn't know that." "He did," she said. "It's going to be seen by a federal judge in Prescott. His name, his words, what he witnessed." She held the man's gaze. "Your father's account is part of what puts Harrison Sterling in front of a court." Flores was quiet. His jaw moved. He put his hat back on. "What can I do?" he said. "Come back tonight," she said. "Bring anyone you trust." He nodded and left. 2 more men came before noon. Then a woman, the wife of one of the shaft foremen, bringing food for the clinic patients and information about Pike's current location, which was the company office. His hand being treated by a Dr. Sterling had brought in from Benson. The woman's name was Consuela, and she had been inside the company office 3 times that week, delivering laundry, and she had eyes and ears and 19 years of suppressed fury. She told them that Sterling had received a communication that morning. A rider, not the regular mail, a private rider from the direction of Tucson. "He was in the office with the door closed for an hour after," Consuela said. "When he came out, he told the foreman to have all the trailheads checked by evening." She paused. He was very calm. Sterling is always calm when he's decided something. Clay, from the examination room, called out, "What time does he get calm?" Consuela looked toward the doorway. "By midday. Then whatever's coming from Tucson will be here by tomorrow evening. At the latest," Clay said. Evelyn looked at Campbell. "We need those papers tonight," she said. That evening moved with a different quality than the evenings before it. Less concealment, more purpose. Not because the danger had reduced, it hadn't, but because the town's internal calculus had shifted in a direction that caution could no longer hold. Evelyn and Rosaria went to the lower quarter at dusk. Toby went with them as Clay had suggested, and his usefulness was immediate and specific. He knew which path between the Gallegos house and the Reyes house avoided the company watchman's circuit. He knew that the Vargas family's dog was fine with Toby, but would announce strangers, so Toby went to the Vargas door alone and brought Mr. Vargas out to meet Evelyn in the alley. He knew that the Montoya widow kept her door barred after dark, but would open it for Rosaria's. They collected papers for 2.5 hours, medical receipts with water assay figures, transcribed in Aaron's careful hand on the back, clinic invoices with survey measurements in the margins, debt records with dates and transaction figures that meant nothing to an ordinary reader and everything to a federal accountant. Each family produced their paper when Rosaria asked for it, most of them with questions, a few with obvious relief. One older man with tears that he covered quickly. by going to find his hat. 34 pieces of paper, all accounted for. Evelyn brought them back to the clinic wrapped in her shawl. She spread them on the examination table in the order Campbell's key specified. Clay, sitting on the stool beside the table now, his left arm resting against his ribs, working through the pages with her. They matched the water diversion records, the forged assay certifications, the financial transactions hidden behind shell company names. It assembled into a complete and damning picture of a systematic fraud conducted over 4 years against several hundred people who had trusted a legal charter to mean something. It's all here, Evelyn said quietly. Clay was looking at a page that held the names and dates of the falsified safety inspections for Shaft 7, the shaft where Aaron Cross had gone to look for the truth and hadn't come back. He set the page down carefully. All of it goes into the second parcel, he said, tonight. We need a second courier route. Devereaux won't run again for 3 weeks, Campbell said. Not Devereaux, Clay said. Esteban Flores. He said he wanted to help. Flores is a minor, Evelyn said. Sterling's watchers know his face. They know his face in Rattlesnake Ridge, Clay said. They don't know him in Benson or Tucson. If he leaves before dawn on the South Road, not the company road, the old cattle track south of the Mission, he's at the Benson rail connection by mid-afternoon. From Benson, he puts this parcel on the Prescott-bound mail train, addressed to Judge Webb, marked urgent and personal. He looked at Campbell. You have Territorial Medical Board. Letterhead. I do. A letter of introduction from you, on that letterhead, explaining that Flores is transporting urgent medical documentation under your authority. Sterling's watchers are looking for a drifter called Thorne. They're not looking for a miner with a physician's letter and a parcel for the mail train. Campbell nodded slowly. It's a risk for Flores, Evelyn said. It is, Clay said. He knows what he's choosing. Flores, when asked an hour later, didn't hesitate. He sat in the clinic examination room, his worn hat on his knee, and listened to the full explanation without interrupting. When Clay finished, Flores looked at the stack of assembled papers on the table. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at Clay. My father's name is in there, he said. Yes, Clay said. Flores picked up his hat and stood. I'll leave at 4, he said. Before the watchman changed shift, he left to prepare. What happened next was not planned. Or it was, in the sense that it grew from everything that had been planted over the previous days. But it wasn't organized, wasn't summoned, didn't arrive on a schedule. It arrived the way courage arrives in groups, which is never all at once, but in sequence. One person at a time, each one making it slightly easier for the next. The clinic's front room began to fill, not with patients. The clinic patients were in the back. The people who came through the front door from 7 o'clock onward came without specific invitation. Esteban Flores had talked to someone before he went to prepare. Rosaria had talked to 2 of the women in the quarter. Consuela had said something to the shaft foreman's brother. Word moved the way it always moved in Rattlesnake Ridge, finding every gap. By 8 o'clock, there were 30 people in and around the clinic, spilling onto the front step and into the narrow road. Miners, their wives, a few of the older children who'd been born in this town and had no other. The young couple from New Mexico, who'd registered their claim through Evelyn's archive 3 days ago. 2 of the women from the upper quarter who'd contributed food for the clinic patients. Senora Delgado, who was 72 years old and had been coming to the archive to check her deed every 3 weeks for 9 years. Clay stood in the clinic doorway. He was not a man for speeches. He'd seen too many speeches from men who used words the way Pike used theatrical rope, for effect rather than truth. But he looked at the faces in front of him, lit by the lanterns. Petra and Campbell had hung from the clinic porch, and he understood what they needed. Not performance, clarity. Sterling has told you this territory belongs to him, he said. His voice carried in the still night air without effort. He's told you the water is his to ration. The mines are his to run as he sees fit, and your labor and your health and your children's future simply costs he's entitled to calculate. He paused. He's been able to say all of that because he controls the sheriff, the company marshal, the supply lines, and the legal instruments. He's been able to say it because up until recently, the evidence of what he's actually done has been kept quiet. He looked at the crowd. It's not quiet anymore, he said. The proof of everything Sterling has done to this valley, the water diversion, the poison supply, the forged records, the illegal claim transfers, it exists. It's documented in Aaron Cross's records and in the sworn testimonies of 31 men who worked these mines and in the hands of a federal judge who doesn't take bribes. He let that settle. Tomorrow night, a second set of that evidence leaves for Prescott. Sterling can lock the trailheads. He can bring in men from Tucson. He cannot stop a parcel that's already on a mail train. He looked at specific faces. Flores, near the back, Rosaria, to the left. Consuela, the shaft foreman's young wife. There will be a confrontation, he said. Probably tomorrow. Sterling is going to move before he loses his window. And when he does, he is going to ask you to stay inside and keep your heads down. He looked at them directly. I can't make that decision for you. Every person here has a family and a cost they're calculating. I understand that, he stopped. Evelyn stepped forward. She had not planned this either. She had been standing just inside the clinic doorway, and she stepped out onto the porch beside Clay, and people moved slightly to see her better, and she held up what she was carrying. Aaron's coat. She'd retrieved it from the archive earlier. The worn brown canvas work coat he'd worn every day she'd known him. She'd kept it on a hook inside the record room door because she hadn't known what else to do with it, and she hadn't been ready to do anything else with it. She held it up in the lamplight. My husband wore this, she said. Her voice was clear and direct. He was not a gunfighter or a marshal or a man of any particular physical power. He was a land recorder. He carried a pen and a survey book and a statutory knowledge of territorial law. She held the coat higher. He gathered evidence for 3 years in this coat's pockets. He distributed it to your families in this coat's pockets. He died for what he put in those pockets. The crowd was very still. He did all of that because he believed something that Harrison Sterling has spent a decade and a half trying to make this town forget, she said. That river and your dignity aren't favors granted by Harrison Sterling. They're your birthright as free men. She looked at the faces in front of her. Bow your heads today, and you hand your children iron collars for tomorrow. Nobody spoke. The windmill at the south end of the property turned in the night wind. The lanterns swayed. Then Esteban Flores took off his worn hat. It was a simple gesture. He just took it off and held it against his chest and looked at the ground for a moment, the gesture of a man making a private commitment in a public place. The man beside him did the same. Then Rosaria. Then the shaft foreman's wife. Then, one by one, across the 30 people gathered in the lamplight outside Campbell's clinic, hats came off and heads bowed. Not in defeat, in the other kind. The kind that means I will carry this. Clay stood on the porch and watched it. He had seen men go to war. He had seen men driven by fury and by desperation and by the recruited conviction of people who'd been told what to think. This was not any of those things. This was people who had weighed the cost accurately and had decided to pay it anyway, which was the only kind of courage that actually held when the morning came. He looked at Evelyn beside him. She was looking at Aaron's coat in her hands. Her face was composed, but composed the way a river is composed, things moving steadily underneath. She folded the coat over her arm. She looked up and met Clay's eyes. He held her gaze. There were things in the space between them that neither of them had said yet, things that belonged to a future they hadn't earned the right to discuss, while Rattlesnake Ridge was still in crisis. But the space was there, and they both knew it was there. And for this particular moment, that was sufficient. The crowd began to talk, not the low, careful talk of frightened people monitoring their own volume. Open talk, names and plans and questions who would stand where and who could be trusted, and what the morning would require. Campbell moved through the crowd with his physician's practical attention, asking about health, about the families in the back room, about the men with the worst lung damage who needed to be positioned away from whatever confrontation was coming. Rosaria organized. She was a natural organizer, direct and unornamented, giving instructions with the quiet authority of a woman who'd been managing impossible circumstances for 19 years and was simply now doing it with a purpose she could name. Flores came to Clay before he left to prepare for his 4 o'clock departure. The cattle track south of the mission, Flores said. You're sure it's not watched? Dodd and Renfrew are watching the North Road and the main east track, Clay said. The cattle track hasn't been used for regular traffic in 2 years since the southern herd was sold off. Sterling's men don't think anyone's using it. He paused. Leave your horse at the Benson livery and take the mail connection from the depot. A man with a medical parcel and a physician's letter is ordinary. Don't vary from ordinary. Flores nodded. And when I come back the same way. By the time you're back, this will be resolved one way or the other. Flores looked at him steadily. Which way? Our way, Clay said. That's what I'm working toward. Flores put his hat on and left. The crowd thinned over the next hour, people returning to their homes and their children and their calculations, carrying with them whatever they'd arrived at in the lamplight outside the clinic. Not all of them would stand when the moment came. Clay knew that. Rosaria knew that. Evelyn knew that. You couldn't predict which 30% would find it too much when the actual weight descended. But 30 people had come without being summoned, and that was 30 more than Sterling had accounted for. And that asymmetry mattered. Campbell locked the clinic at 9:30. Petra stayed with the backroom patients. Clay settled in the examination room because his ribs made a compelling case for horizontal. Evelyn sat at the small desk and worked through the organization of the collected papers, making clean copies of the key sections in her own hand. The way she'd copied deed records her whole professional life, precise and legible and fast. She worked for 2 hours. When she set the pen down, the copies were done. The originals and the copies were separated into 2 parcels, one for Flores to carry south at 4 in the morning, one to remain at the clinic as backup in the Hearthstone Gap. She capped the ink bottle. She looked at Clay. He was asleep, finally, properly asleep. His breathing even, and slow and clear. The fever had not returned. The color in his face in the lamplight was something closer to normal. She looked at Aaron's coat on the hook beside the door where she'd hung it when she came in. She thought about what he'd built. 40 families, 40 pieces of ordinary paper, 31 sworn testimonies, a system so thoroughly distributed that the only way to destroy it was to destroy the people who held it. And destroying the people who held it would itself be the proof of everything the documents alleged. He had made the people into the evidence. He had made their survival into the argument. She pressed her palms flat on the desk and thought, I see it now. I see what you built. She blew out the lamp. In the dark clinic, with the desert night doing its slow work outside, and the windmill turning, and Clay breathing steady, and Aaron's coat on the hook by the door, she sat for a while in the dark and let herself feel the full weight of the day. Then she straightened her spine, the way she always did. Tomorrow was going to require everything they had. Flores left at 4 in the morning without incident. Clay heard the horse pass south of the clinic property, the hoofbeats on the old cattle track, muffled by soft earth, going steady and unhurried into the dark. He lay on the examination table and listened until the sound disappeared, and then he stared at the ceiling for a while and ran the arithmetic one more time. Evidence Parcel 1, with Devereaux, en route to Prescott, 2 days out. Evidence Parcel 2, with Flores, heading south to Benson and the mail train. 8 hours from the rail connection. Evidence backup in the Hearthstone Gap at Campbell's clinic. 3 independent routes. 3 chances for at least one to reach Harlan Webb. Sterling could intercept riders on the roads he controlled, but he couldn't intercept a parcel already on a government mail train. And he didn't know about the Hearthstone Gap. The arithmetic was as good as Clay could make it. He sat up. His ribs were a sustained argument against every movement he'd made since Devil's Chasm. But they were a manageable argument, the kind you acknowledge and then set aside, because the alternative is lying still while the world continues without your input. The stitches on his lateral wound were holding. The fever hadn't returned in the night. He was functional. Functional was what was available. He'd work with it. By the time Campbell came through from the back room at 5:30, Clay was dressed, coat on, standing at the front window, looking at the pre-dawn dark of the Mission Road. "You should still be horizontal," Campbell said. "What's Sterling doing this morning?" Campbell accepted the topic change with the resigned practicality of a physician dealing with a difficult patient. Consuela sent word last night. Sterling called his full crew back to the company office by 10 o'clock. All of them, including the men watching the clinic and the men Dodd brought from Tucson. He paused. She counted 11 horses at the hitching post. 11. Clay turned this over. Before Devil's Chasm, the tally had been Pike's 6, reduced by the street fight and then reduced further at the chasm. Dodd and Renfrew, plus whoever they'd come ahead of. 11 horses at the company office meant Sterling had called in reinforcements overnight. The Tucson men had arrived ahead of schedule. "They'll move today," Clay said. "That's my read as well," Campbell said. Clay turned from the window. "I need to know the layout of Main Street from the hardware store north. Every door, every window, every structure that can be used for elevation." Campbell looked at him. "You've been in this town for 5 days. I've been watching it for 5 days, Clay said. "But I need to know what I don't know. What's behind the feed store, where the blind spots are on the north end?" Campbell was a 60-year-old physician who had lived in Rattlesnake Ridge for 22 years. He knew the town the way a man knows a place he's walked every day, in all weathers and all hours. He sat down and talked, and Clay listened with the focused attention of someone building a structure in their mind, placing each piece of information in its spatial relationship to every other. Evelyn arrived at 6. She came in from the back with a covered basket, bread and coffee from Rosaria's kitchen, and the information that 3 men from the lower quarter had spent the night in quiet preparation, blocking the back alley behind the feed store with a loaded wagon positioned to prevent mounted access, and storing pickaxes and pry bars in the loading dock of the mining supply warehouse at the south end of Main Street. She said this while she poured coffee, matter-of-factly the way she filed a deed. Clay looked at her over his cup. "Rosaria organized it," Evelyn said. "I told her what we needed the street to do." "A loaded wagon in the alley cuts off their mounted flanking approach," Clay said. "That was the idea," she said. He looked at her for a moment. She had been awake most of the night working. He knew that, and she looked it, the careful composure of her face, built from fewer hours of sleep than it needed. But her eyes were clear, and her hands on the coffee pot were steady. "Sterling's men won't shoot at women," he said. It was not a comfortable sentence to say, but it was a tactical reality. Not in the open, not in daylight, not with the evidence already in federal hands. "That changes what's survivable. He'll shoot at you," she said. "He'll try." She sat down across from him at the small table. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "There's something I want to say," she said. He waited. "When this is done," she said, "when the federal men come and the court proceedings begin and Rattlesnake Ridge starts the process of remembering what normal looks like, there will be a lot of work. Legal work. The mining cooperatives will need organizational documents. The homesteaders will need their water rights redeeded. The archive will need to rebuild its cross-reference files from what we salvaged." She looked at him directly. "That's months of work, maybe a year." He held her gaze. "I'm telling you that, so you know the situation clearly," she said. "Not to ask anything of you. You said you'd leave when it was done, and I'm not asking you to revisit that. Evelyn, he said. She waited. I said I didn't know, he said. What I'd do after. She looked at him for a moment. Yes, you did say that. I still don't know, he said, but the direction of my not knowing has changed. She looked at the table, at her coffee, at her hands. Then she looked back at him with the direct, clear gaze she brought to things that mattered. She nodded once. That was all. Just the nod. But they both understood it for what it was. The careful, provisional acknowledgement of two people who have been alone long enough to be cautious and hurt enough to be honest. They drank their coffee. The morning came on in its slow Arizona way, the dark going purple, then gray, then the first hard line of orange over the eastern ridge. By 7 o'clock, the sun was up and the town was moving. Main Street had its ordinary morning traffic for exactly 40 minutes. Then it didn't. The word came from Toby, who was back at his loft and watching with the specific hawk-eyed attention of a 10-year-old who understood the stakes and had decided to be useful rather than safe. He appeared at the clinic door at 7:40 with the message that Sterling had left the company office with 9 men and that they were moving south along Main Street, and that the bounty notice was already nailed to the post outside the sheriff's office. $500 gold, Clayton Thorne. Dead or alive, though the order of preference was implicit. Clay read the notice when Evelyn brought it, torn from the post by Senora Delgado's nephew, who had strong feelings about bounty notices and a willingness to act on them. $500 was a significant amount of money in Rattlesnake Ridge. In the lower quarter, it represented close to 2 years' wages for a shaft miner. It would motivate men who hadn't been motivated by anything else. It'll bring people out of the hills, Clay said. Men we don't know and haven't accounted for. Then we move before they arrive, Evelyn said. He nodded. We need Main Street by 9 o'clock. They prepared. Clay and Evelyn went to the archive first. She unlocked it, opened the record books, and sat at her desk, because the archive being open was a statement of ordinary defiance, and it needed to be seen. Clay went to the hardware store next door and spoke briefly with the owner, a quiet man named Hector Baines, who had not attended the clinic gathering the night before, but who, when Clay made his request, produced rope, a coil of it, without a word and without payment. Clay took the rope. He spent the next 40 minutes working the street. His ribs made the work unpleasant. He did it anyway, moving with the measured efficiency of a man who has allocated his available physical capacity against a task list and is not going to spend any of it on complaint. He worked the south end of Main Street first, moving east to west, and he worked it in plain view of anyone who cared to watch, which was deliberate. Let Sterling's watchers see preparation. Let them carry that back. What he built was not a fortification. A fortification requires materials and time that weren't available. What he built was a channeling system, a set of conditions that would direct the conflict's movement rather than prevent it. The trip lines came first. Thin rope, dark, strung at ankle height across the 3 narrow alleys that fed onto Main Street, from the east side between the hardware store and the livery. Not strong enough to stop a man. Strong enough to catch a running man who wasn't watching his feet in the heat and the chaos of a firefight. Strung at a height that would drop a man hard enough to take him out of the immediate calculation. The mirrors came from Evelyn. She brought them from the archive, 3 of them, pieces she'd salvaged from the ransacked house. Small, hand-sized, but sufficient for what Clay had in mind. He positioned them in the west-facing windows of the barber shop and the dry goods store, angled precisely to catch the morning sun coming over the eastern ridge and throw it east along the street. At 9 o'clock, when the sun was at its particular morning angle over Rattlesnake Ridge, those mirrors would throw blinding reflected light directly into the eyes of anyone approaching from the north end of Main Street. Sterling's men would be coming from the north. The sandbag blinds were Rosaria's contribution. She'd organized them the previous night, the miners filling feed sacks from the hardware store's supply and stacking them in 2 positions on the west side of the street, one in the recessed doorway of the closed milliner's shop, one behind the water trough in front of the barber. Low cover, substantial, enough to work from. By 8:30, the street had been modified, not dramatically. A person walking it quickly wouldn't notice most of it. But Clay walked it, end to end, and read what he'd built, accounting for angles and distances and the specific morning light. And what he saw satisfied him as much as anything could satisfy a man preparing for violence with a cracked rib and 24 hours of compromised sleep. He went to the barber shop. He knocked on the closed door. Baines, the hardware man, opened it. 3 other men were inside, 2 miners from the lower quarter who'd volunteered through Rosaria, and a third man Clay didn't know, middle-aged, with a shotgun in a working man's hands and an expression of resolved fury. "The feed store roof," Clay said. "Both of you." He looked at the 2 miners. "You've been up there before?" "Loading hay bales," said the taller one. "There's a hatch in the back left corner. You go up through that, and you stay flat until I signal. You are there for one specific purpose." He looked at them both. "Sterling will position snipers on the east side rooftops. The feed store gives you the angle to deal with them. You are not there to engage the street-level fight. You are there for the roof." They nodded. "You don't fire until you can see them clearly, and you're certain of your shot," Clay said. "One missed shot from a roof in a street fight is 2 problems. You understand that?" "Yes," the tall one said. "Go now," Clay said, "before they're watching the rooftops." They went. He looked at the man with the shotgun. "You're with Evelyn. You stay at the archive door. You don't leave that position." The man nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something, and then decided the shotgun said it adequately. At 8:50, Clay went back to the archive. Evelyn was at her desk. She looked up when he came in. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked at the room, the repaired shelves, the recovered files, the employment contract in the record book with his name in her handwriting, Aaron's seal ring on her right hand. He reached into the inside pocket of his duster. He produced a pocket watch, silver-cased, old, with a worn hinge on the cover and a dent in the back that had been there long enough to have its own history. He held it out to her. She looked at it. She looked at him. "My father's," he said. "He carried it for 30 years. I've carried it since '64. He paused. "I'd like you to hold it while this is happening." She stood up from the desk. She came to the doorway and she took the watch from his hand. She turned it over, felt the worn silver, the dented back, the weight of 30 years, and then 22 more. She opened the cover. The face was clean and the hands were running, wound that morning. She closed it. She held his gaze. "This is a promise," she said. It was not quite a question. "It's the closest I know how to get to one," he said. "Right now." She held the watch in both hands, her thumbs crossed over its face. "Come back for it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Everything that needed to be said was already said. He turned and went out into the street. 9 o'clock came up over Rattlesnake Ridge like a slow fire. The mirrors caught the morning sun exactly as he'd calculated, throwing long, bright shafts of reflected light east along the street. He tested the angle from the southern end, walking into the light deliberately, feeling it catch his eyes at about 30 yards. Good, better than he'd hoped. He went to the sandbag position behind the water trough. He checked the revolver, fully loaded, checked the rifle, checked the rounds in his coat pockets, 3 separate pockets, each loaded in a specific order he'd maintained for 15 years as a working lawman, because in a sustained firefight, you did not want to be thinking about where you'd put the ammunition. His ribs reported in with their standing complaint. He breathed around it, the shallow, controlled breath of a man managing a mechanical limitation, and waited. Campbell appeared at the clinic door at the south end of the street. He stood in his doorway with his physician's bag at his feet, ready for what his skills required, and understanding that his position at the south end, visible and identified, was itself a statement. You shoot at a physician standing in his doorway, and you tell the territorial press exactly who you are. Sterling knew this, which meant Campbell. Standing there was a cost Sterling would have to calculate. Evelyn's man with the shotgun was at the archive door. Toby was off the street. Clay had been specific about this, and Rosaria had been specific about enforcing it, and Toby had complied with the particular resentment of a child who understands the necessity of a thing and dislikes it on principle. The street was quiet. Then at 9:15, Sterling came. He came from the north end, as anticipated, and he came with 9 men arranged in a loose traveling formation that spread as they entered the open street, moving to the boardwalks on both sides, covering the doorways, establishing their standard street control pattern. They'd done this before. They knew how to make a street feel owned. Sterling himself walked in the center of the road. Clay had not seen him at close range before. Harrison Sterling was 58, tall and lean, impeccably dressed for the frontier, a dark wool coat, polished boots, a hat that cost more than most miners earned in a month. He had the controlled bearing of a man accustomed to being the largest financial fact in any room he entered. He was not carrying a weapon visibly. Men with 9 armed employees didn't need to carry weapons visibly. Pike was not with them. Clay registered this absence with careful attention. Pike's hand was destroyed. He was off the street, which meant he was somewhere else. Somewhere with a sight line. Clay moved. He stepped out from behind the water trough and walked to the center of the street. He stopped 40 yards south of Sterling's position. The 9 men went still. Sterling looked at him with the flat, measuring attention of a man who'd been told this problem was eliminated and was currently receiving information to the contrary. "Mr. Thorne," Sterling said. His voice was even and measured, a man's voice accustomed to contract negotiations to the careful management of other people's fear. "You're a hard man to kill. I've had practice at not being killed," Clay said. "You've had practice at hiring men to try. We've both been at it long enough to know which approach is more reliable." Sterling regarded him. "You're injured. I'm functional," Clay said. "There's a difference." Sterling's eyes moved briefly to the mirrors in the west-facing windows. He clocked them, calculated their angle, understood what they were for. He was a smart man. That was the thing about smart men who had money and power. Their intelligence served their certainty rather than questioning it, and eventually the certainty became the problem. "You've sent documents to Prescott," Sterling said. "I know that, then you know what's in them," Clay said. "I know what someone claims is in them." Sterling's expression was unchanged. "Claims can be challenged. Documentation can be questioned. I have lawyers in Tucson who have been questioning territorial land documentation for 20 years. "You have lawyers?" Clay said. "I have 31 sworn testimonies from your own employees, water assay records that your own company's instruments produced, deed transfer documents filed in the Territorial Recorder's Office in Tucson, and a federal circuit judge who has seen everything." He paused. "Your lawyers are going to be very busy." Sterling looked at him with the particular stillness of a man deciding. $500, Sterling said. "That's what the notice says. I'll make it 1,000 right now. To whoever in this street is holding a gun, you don't need to work for it. Just don't stop it from happening." Silence on the street. Nobody moved. The 9 men held their positions. The morning light threw its bright reflected shafts from the mirror windows. The sandbag position was empty, Clay having moved, but the trap lines in the alleys were still there, invisible from the north end at this angle. Sterling looked at his men. He nodded. 3 of them moved forward. What happened next happened in pieces, the way a sustained firefight always does. Not the clean choreography of novels, but the ugly, overlapping, partially visible reality of multiple things occurring at once across an uncontrolled space. The first man hit the trip line in the east alley so hard he went face first into the dirt with the rifle under him. The shot it discharged, going into the adobe wall above the hardware store door and producing a fist-sized hole and a shower of plaster dust. The second man came straight down the center of the street toward Clay, and he was good, legitimately good, fast and measured, and Clay gave ground and went left, and the shot that should have taken him, center mass, took the edge of his duster instead, a clean cut through the canvas 2 inches from his unwounded side, close enough to feel the displaced air. Clay dropped him with the shoulder shot that took his gun arm and sat him down in the street. The third man had moved to the east boardwalk and was making for elevation. The steps outside the feed store, heading for the roof through the exterior ladder, and he was on the second rung when the 2 miners Clay had positioned came up through the hatch, and one of them called down, "Don't." The man on the ladder looked up. He came down from the ladder. Sterling's remaining 6 men were in various states of repositioning, reading the field, calculating odds with the professional attention of hired men who understand that $500 is not worth dying. For if the math has changed, the math had changed. Clay stood in the center of the street, with his left arm pressed against his ribs, breathing in the controlled way that managed the pain, his gun hand steady. "You're done, Sterling," he said. Sterling looked at the street, at the man sitting in the dirt holding his shoulder, at the man getting up from the east alley with dirt on his face, at the man who'd come down from the feed store ladder, at the 6 men who were no longer advancing. He looked at Clay. At that moment, from the south end of the street, Senora Delgado's nephew appeared at the loading dock of the mining supply warehouse. Then 2 miners, then Consuela, then Rosaria, with 4 men from the lower quarter, who were carrying pickaxes and pry bars, with the purposeful bearing of people who'd thought carefully about whether they were willing to use them and had reached a conclusion. They positioned themselves at the south end of the street, not threatening, just present, blocking retreat, standing in the daylight of their own town on their own ground. Sterling looked at them. He looked at the loading dock, at the pickaxes, at Rosaria, who looked back at him with the absolute, unmovable composure of a woman who had buried her husband in the lower quarter cemetery and stood in the street today with nothing left to lose, and had therefore become the most dangerous kind of person in any equation. Sterling's face did not change, but something behind it did. "Mr. Thorne," Sterling said, his voice still even, "this is not finished." "It's further along than you'd like," Clay said, "and it moves further along every hour the mail train gets closer to Prescott." Sterling held his position for 5 more seconds. Then he turned and walked north. His 9 men fell in around him, reading the signal, the fight recalibrating into withdrawal. They moved with controlled, professional dignity, the retreat of men who understood they'd taken a position that hadn't held and were now receiving new instructions. Clay watched them go. He did not lower his gun until they'd turned the corner at the north end of Main Street and the sound of their boots on the boardwalk had diminished. Then he lowered it. He pressed his left arm against his ribs and breathed carefully, the ribs reporting in at increased volume following the last several minutes. He stood in the middle of the street and took stock. His shoulder wound from 3 days ago was intact. The lateral wound from Devil's Chasm was burning steadily at its stitched line, probably stressed by the movement, but it hadn't blown open. The man sitting in the street with the shoulder shot was alive and conscious, and looking at his own blood with the expression of a man coming to terms with a decision he couldn't undecide. Campbell was already walking north from the clinic. He crouched beside the wounded man with the focused practicality of a physician for whom political affiliations were not a medical variable. Clay looked south. Evelyn was standing in the archive doorway. She was holding his father's pocket watch in her right hand, her thumb over the dented silver back. She was watching him with the clear, steady attention she brought to everything that mattered to her. He walked south. He stopped at the archive steps. She held the watch out. He took it. Their fingers met briefly in the exchange, her hand warm around the cool silver, his hand closing over both. He looked at her. She looked back. Around them, Rattlesnake Ridge was beginning the tentative, disbelieving process of breathing again. Doors opening, voices, boots on boardwalks. Rosaria and her men still at the south end, watchful. Campbell working in the street, the two miners coming down from the feed store roof, the sun cutting hard and bright across the red dust of beauty. He'll come back, Evelyn said. Tonight or tomorrow. He won't accept this. No, Clay said. He won't. He pocketed the watch. He looked north. Sterling had retreated, but Sterling hadn't surrendered. And there was a meaningful distance between those two conditions. The evidence was in transit. The miners were organized. The street had held. None of that was the same as finished. Tomorrow would tell the story. He looked at Evelyn. Anything left in that coffee pot? He said. She almost smiled. The full version this time, both corners reaching her eyes. Come inside, she said. He followed her in. Sunrise came slow and red over Rattlesnake Ridge. The fog rolled in from the canyon before dawn, thick and low, carrying the smell of dust and something metallic. Clay stood at the archive window and watched it settle across Main Street. His ribs ached. His bandages were tight. He'd slept 3 hours and woken with the particular clarity that comes when the body decides rest is finished, whether you're ready or not. He dressed, checked the Colt, checked it again. Evelyn came in from the kitchen with coffee he didn't have time to drink. They're moving, she said. Toby saw them. Pike's crew, 6 men, coming south from the company office. Pike himself? Leading them. Clay set the cup down untouched. He walked out onto Main Street alone. The fog turned everything gray and soft. The windmill turned without sound. His boots on the hardpack were the only noise for a long moment. He stopped in the center of the road, blood already seeping slow through the linen bandages at his side, and he waited. They came from the north end. Pike first, his right hand wrapped in black cloth, useless at his side, his left holding a revolver. 5 men fanned out behind him in a line across the street, full spread, deliberate. They'd thought about this. Pike looked at Clay across 40 yards of red dust and morning fog. Last chance to ride out, Pike called. Sterling's being generous. You walk away, the widow keeps her archive. Nobody gets buried today. Clay said nothing. I got 5 men and 6 guns, Pike said. You got a hole in your side and a bad night behind you. You've got 5 men, Clay said. Go ahead and count the coffins. Pike smiled. It didn't reach anywhere past his mouth. He raised his left hand, and the line spread wider. 2 men angling toward the east boardwalk, 1 going for the alley beside the feed store, 2 holding the center with Pike. Clay moved first. He went left, fast, the ribs screaming as he cut across the street toward the barber shop. The first shot from Pike's center man cracked past his ear and punched into the water trough behind him. Clay fired once from a low crouch, clipped the man's knee, dropped him. 5 left. The man in the alley hit the trip line. The crash was loud enough to turn heads. The man went down hard on the loose gravel, rifle skidding away from him. He was trying to get up when Clay crossed the alley mouth and kicked the rifle clear. Stay down, Clay said. He stayed down. The 2 men on the east boardwalk were moving for elevation, heading for the feed store roof. They made it to the exterior ladder. One of them got 3 rungs up. The hatch opened. Rosario's 2 miners came up from inside, same as the day before, and one of them looked down from the roof with the calm expression of a man holding a significant advantage. Don't, he said. The man on the ladder came down. That left Pike and 2 men in the center of the street. Clay stepped back into the open. His side was burning. He could feel the bandage wet against his shirt. He breathed through it, the shallow, careful breath that managed the pain without letting it manage him. Pike's 2 men flanked wide. One moved to Clay's left, one to his right, trying to split his attention, get him turning. Good tactics. Professional. Clay shot the one on the left in the gun hand at 15 yards. The man dropped his weapon and grabbed his wrist and swore in a sustained way that suggested he had opinions about the morning. The one on the right charged. He covered the ground fast, and Clay let him come, stepped inside at the last second, and brought the barrel of the Colt across his temple. The man dropped the way men drop when the lights go off without warning. Pike stood alone in the middle of Main Street. His left hand was shaking, not from fear exactly, from the specific fury of a man who has watched a plan fail in real time and cannot stop it. "It's over," Clay said. "You don't get to decide that," Pike said. He raised the revolver. From the alley beside the dry goods store, a shot cracked out. Not aimed at Clay, it hit Pike in the back. Pike dropped. Clay turned. Harrison Sterling stepped out of the alley with a smoking pistol in his hand, and his face arranged in the careful composure of a man who had not just shot his own man in the back, but was prepared to discuss a version of events in which that wasn't what had happened. "Self-defense," Sterling said. Pike was becoming a liability. Clay looked at Pike on the ground. Pike was alive, barely. His left hand was pressed against his back, and his eyes were open, and he was looking up at the sky with the particular expression of a man adding up what just happened. Sterling took a step toward the fallen strongbox near Pike's belt. "The records," Sterling said. "The bribery records Pike was carrying are company property." "Don't touch that box," Clay said. Sterling looked at him, at the gun. He made the calculation that men with money always make, which is that money is a kind of armor, and that it has always been enough before. He reached for the box. Clay closed the distance in 3 strides and hit Sterling with the full weight of a man who was past the point of patience. Not the gun. His hand, flat and hard, taking Sterling off his feet and putting him on the ground, one knee on his chest, the Colt against his jaw. "Federal court," Clay said. "You're going to stand in front of one. Alive." Sterling looked up at him. The composure was gone now. What was underneath it was smaller than Clay had expected. Fear dressed up for decades in fine wool. "You can't—" "I already have," Clay said. Pike raised his good hand from the ground. In it was the strongbox key. He looked at Clay, then at Evelyn, who had crossed the street and was standing 3 feet away. He threw it to her. She caught it. She opened the box. Inside were ledgers, deposit slips, payroll records with the sheriff's name, and the judge in Tucson and 4 territorial officials. All of it in Sterling's handwriting. All of it dated. She looked at Clay. He was still holding Sterling down and breathing careful and watching the street. Dr. Campbell was already moving through the wounded men, kneeling, assessing, doing what he did without ceremony or preference. 2 of the miners brought water. Evelyn crossed to the nearest of Pike's fallen crew and tore a strip from her shawl and pressed it against a bleeding arm wound while the man watched her with his mouth slightly open. Nobody shot at anybody. The cycle of frontier bloodletting stopped right there in the red dust, not because the violence was finished, but because the people who'd survived it decided to be the kind of people who stopped it. Sterling was still on the ground. Clay stood up and looked north. The street was quiet. The fog was burning off. In the distance, the windmill turned. It was done. The federal judge arrived 11 days later. He came with 4 marshals and a government attorney and a wagon that held enough paperwork to fill Evelyn's entire archive twice over. His name was Harlan Webb. He was 71 years old, irascible in the specific way of old men who are still right most of the time and know it. And he had Clay's second evidence parcel in his coat pocket when he rode into Rattlesnake Ridge on a Tuesday morning. He didn't stay at the hotel. He set up in Evelyn's archive, which was the most organized legal space in town, and he worked 12 hours a day for a week and a half. Sterling sat in the county lockup in Tucson before the first week was out. The bribery records from Pike's strongbox took down the purchased sheriff in Tucson, 2 county officials, and a territorial land commissioner who had been signing off on Sterling's fraudulent claim transfers for 6 years. The water diversion evidence, combined with 31 sworn testimonies and Aaron's assembled ledger, built a case that Webb called the most thoroughly documented fraud he had seen in 22 years on the territorial bench. He said it without satisfaction. Just observation, the way judges note things. The water rights went back to the homesteaders by order of federal court. The mines were reorganized as worker cooperatives under a territorial charter. The reorganization documents drafted and filed in Evelyn's archive over 3 long evenings with Rosaria and Esteban Flores and 4 other men from the lower quarter sitting at the table and asking the right questions. Campbell's clinic received permanent territorial funding, approved as part of the court settlement. The supply embargo ended. The medicine came. Pike survived his back wound. He cooperated extensively with the federal attorney and received a reduced sentence that he seemed to find neither fair nor unfair, just the arithmetic of the situation. Dodd and Renfrew rode back to Tucson the day Webb arrived. They didn't come back. On the 14th day after the street fight, Clay walked to the lower quarter cemetery. It was early morning, the good quiet hour before the heat settled in. The cemetery sat at the edge of the scrub east of the worker quarter, marked by a low adobe wall and a gate that someone had recently repainted white. Not professionally. Carefully, Aaron Cross's grave was near the eastern wall. A simple stone, his name and dates, and the phrase "honest man" in plain letters. Someone had left dried marigolds against it, the same orange-red as the ones in Rosaria Vega's window. Clay stood there a while. He took his hat off. He held it in both hands and looked at the stone and said nothing out loud, because Aaron would have found a speech excessive, and Clay had never been given to them anyway. He thought about Tennessee, about a creek that ran cold in August, about the things a man builds when he decides to stop running from what happened and start building toward what comes next. He put his hat back on. He walked back through the cemetery gate and latched it behind him. At the archive, he found the trunk. It was an old iron box, the kind used for tools, heavy and lockable, sitting on the floor of Aaron's workshop where Clay had moved it 2 days earlier. He'd oiled the hinges. He sat down on the workshop step, and he unstrapped the Colt from his hip and held it for a moment. He'd carried it for 15 years. It was a good gun. It had done what guns do, which is end situations that other tools could not. It had no opinions about itself. He cleaned it, oiled the cylinder, ran the cloth along the barrel with the patient attention of a man saying goodbye to something properly. Then he placed it inside the trunk, the holster and belt folded beside it, and he closed the lid and turned the key and set the trunk in the back corner of the workshop, under the shelf where Aaron's mallet hung. Not buried, not destroyed, just put away. He walked into the kitchen. Evelyn was at the table with a cup of coffee and the morning's record work, the archive's backlog of deed filings still substantial after everything that had happened. She looked up when he came in. She looked at his hip, at the empty holster that wasn't there anymore. He sat down across from her. She poured him coffee without being asked and went back to her records and didn't, which was exactly right. And Clay knew it was exactly right. And that was the thing about her. Outside, the windmill turned. The good one, on the south end, the one Campbell had maintained for years, smooth and steady in the morning wind. The mountains were clear, properly blue-gray on the horizon, patient as they'd always been, the kind of patience that outlasts everything built in their shadow. Clay looked at the record books open on the table, the deed filings, the cooperative charters, the months of legal work still ahead. He picked up a pen. "Show me where you need help," he said. Evelyn looked at him across the table, something warm and clear in her eyes. No walls left in it, just her. She turned the record book toward him and pointed to the column. He bent his head and started to write. The true measure of a man's strength out west was never how fast he could clear leather. It was whether he had the backbone to stand beside the broken and build something that outlived the grave. Rattlesnake Ridge was learning that now, one filed deed at a time, one shared morning at a time, under the wide Arizona sky that kept no favorites and made no promises and was beautiful anyway. This is a work of pure fiction. All characters, locations, and events are entirely the product of the author's imagination and bear no relation to any persons or actual events.